Tonight, we begin a gentle journey, a path of quiet discovery woven through the lives of those who seek meaning in the unseen. There is nothing you need to do, nothing to fix, no one you need to become. Simply rest, allowing your breath to deepen, softly, slowly. If this path calls to you, I invite you to subscribe, to join us in these moments of stillness. We will explore how beauty can emerge where we least expect it, how the most ordinary tasks can reveal profound truths, and how our own perceived emptiness might, in fact, be a beginning. Let us begin this journey together, breathing in, breathing out, allowing ourselves to settle into this moment. In a quiet village, nestled between whispering fields and the ancient forest, lived a collector of iridescent beauty. Her name was Tanvi. The village itself seemed to breathe with a soft, steady rhythm, attuned to the gentle cycle of sun and moon. Mornings would unfurl with the golden glow of light filtering through ancient leaves, illuminating dust motes dancing in the cool air of workshops. Afternoons settled into a quiet hum, punctuated by the distant murmur of a flowing river or the whisper of wind through bamboo groves. Evenings would deepen into a soft indigo as twilight settled over the hills, bringing with it the subtle chirping of unseen birds. It was a place where human hands engaged in simple, honest crafts, where patience was a virtue, and where wisdom often revealed itself in the patient observation of the mundane. Tanvi, a woman in her early 30s, moved through this world with a quiet intensity, a gentle stillness that belied the delicate precision of her work. Her fingers, slender and stained with the faint residue of shell lacquer, possessed a practiced grace, arranging the tiny, shimmering carapaces with an almost reverent care. Her dark hair was often pulled back tightly, revealing eyes that, while sharp for discerning the most minute detail in a beetle's wing, held a distant, almost melancholic gaze. It was a look that seemed to reflect an inner landscape, a feeling of something beautiful that had perhaps quietly faded within herself. She dressed in simple, practical tunics, favoring muted greens and browns that allowed her to blend seamlessly with the forest edges where she found her treasures. Tanvi was a collector of beetle shells, not for their scientific classification, but for the ethereal, lasting shimmer they held. Her workshop, a small, sun-dappled space scented faintly with earth and the subtle, sweet tang of preservation oils, was a sanctuary of quiet dedication. Here, on polished wooden tables, lay trays filled with her finds: the jewel-toned wings of scarab beetles, the emerald gleam of longhorns, the deep sapphire of iridescent ground beetles. Each shell, a miniature work of art, caught the light and fractured it into 1,000 dancing hues, a silent symphony of color. Her process was a meticulous ritual. After a day spent patiently searching the forest floor, carefully lifting fallen leaves, or gently examining the bark of ancient trees, Tanvi would return with her delicate bounty. Each shell, no matter how small, was treated with the utmost respect. She would clean them with soft brushes, removing every speck of forest dust, every trace of the earth from which they had been lifted. Then, with a steady hand, she would apply a thin, almost invisible layer of a natural lacquer, a secret blend passed down through generations. This lacquer, she believed, was the key to preserving their ephemeral beauty, to making their shimmer endure, to ensuring their iridescence would last long after the life that once animated them had passed. She would spend hours, lost in concentration, admiring the subtle shifts of color, the way the light played across the curved surfaces, the seemingly impossible depth of their sheen. For Tanvi, each shell was a testament to a beauty that transcended life itself, a quiet echo of vibrancy that remained perfected in its stillness. She would arrange them, first by species, then by size, then by the particular quality of their shimmer, creating intricate patterns that were themselves a form of art. These shells would then become components for delicate jewelry, woven into necklaces or set into small, intricate brooches, carried by others who also sought to capture a piece of that lasting quiet beauty. Yet, beneath her precise movements, beneath the quiet dedication to her craft, Tanvi carried a deep sense of personal emptiness. It was a feeling that hummed softly, persistently, just beneath the surface of her awareness, a quiet ache in the center of her being. She felt as though her own beauty, her own vitality, had faded, much like the vibrant colors of a leaf after it falls from the branch. She saw herself at times as a beautiful but hollow shell, retaining the outward form of life, but lacking the inner spark, the vibrant energy she so admired in the shells she collected. There was a paradox in her devotion to these shimmering husks. She sought to preserve a lasting beauty in them while secretly mourning its perceived loss within herself. This internal longing, this quiet ache for renewal, began to subtly influence her work. She found herself chasing a more vibrant, a more enduring iridescence, hoping to find a lasting quality that might somehow mirror what she felt was lost within herself. Her search became a subtle reflection of her internal longing, a quiet ache for renewal, for a feeling of being filled, whole, and radiantly alive once more. She began to experiment. She would venture deeper into the forest, seeking out different varieties of beetles, convinced that some species must hold a more profound, more resilient shimmer than others. She spent days patiently observing, learning the habits of the insects, trying to understand what made one shell gleam with a deeper, more profound jewel tone than another. She sought out specimens from new, untouched clearings, believing that a fresher shell, one recently shed or found, might hold a more potent, more enduring sparkle. She would compare the shells found in the dappled light of the forest floor to those discovered near the exposed roots of an ancient tree, searching for any subtle difference in their inherent luminosity. And then she would experiment with new preservation methods. She tried different blends of oils, different lacquers, some made from tree resins, others from secret herbal concoctions. She adjusted the drying times, the temperature of her workshop, the angle of the light, always searching for that elusive method that would not just preserve, but enhance the shimmer, making it truly eternal. She would hold a newly lacquered shell up to the soft light filtering through her window, turning it slowly, meticulously, hoping to catch a new depth, a more vibrant glow. But even when she achieved a perfect, breathtaking iridescence, a quiet dissatisfaction would remain, a sense that the beauty was always out there, in the shell, never quite in here, within herself. Her pursuit was relentless, though always expressed with her characteristic quiet intensity. She found herself drawn to the beetles with the most complex, most multifaceted colors, those that shifted from green to blue to purple with the slightest turn. She sought out the ones with the deepest, most saturated hues, believing that their inherent vibrance might hold a secret, a lesson in enduring beauty. She would spend hours polishing, her breath held, her concentration absolute, trying to coax forth every last glimmer, every hidden facet of light from the tiny carapaces. Each evening, as the indigo deepened outside her window, Tanvi would sit amidst her trays of shimmering shells, the quiet glow of the lamplight catching their myriad colors. She would pick one up, a particularly brilliant specimen, turning it slowly in her fingers. It was perfect, flawless, a testament to enduring beauty. And yet, as she gazed at its radiant, perfected emptiness, a quiet sigh would escape her. The beauty was there, undeniably, but the ache within her, the sense of her own faded light, remained. She yearned for a shimmer that was not just observed, but felt, a radiance that belonged not just to the outer world, but to the deepest, most quiet corners of her own being. And so, her quest for lasting beauty, for an enduring iridescence, continued, a gentle, persistent search in the quiet corners of her world. And so, her quest for lasting beauty, for an enduring iridescence, continued, a gentle, persistent search in the quiet corners of her world. She ventured deeper, past the familiar paths where the sunlight dappled the forest floor in predictable patterns. She sought out the untouched groves, the ancient trees whose roots twisted like old stories into the earth, the places where the light shifted in unfamiliar ways, believing that perhaps there, a different kind of shimmer might reveal itself. Days blurred into weeks, marked by the changing scent of the forest, from the earthy dampness after a rain to the dry, sun-baked aroma of summer leaves. Each morning, she would rise with the first whisper of dawn, her simple basket woven from reeds slung over her shoulder, her eyes already scanning the awakening world for a hint of that elusive glow. She found many shells, some breathtaking in their perfection, others unique in their subtle flaws. She cleaned them, lacquered them, arranged them, but the quiet ache persisted. Each time she held a newly polished specimen, watching the light dance across its surface, a part of her would marvel, and another part would sigh. The beauty was external, a reflection, never quite settling within her own core. It was a paradox. She held such vibrant, enduring beauty in her hands, yet felt its absence within her own being. She yearned for a radiance that felt inherent, not merely observed, a shimmer that resonated with her very self, not just the exquisite husks she collected. One particularly warm afternoon, the air thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, Tanvi found herself in a clearing she had never seen before. The sunlight filtered through the canopy in long golden shafts, illuminating dust motes that danced in the still air. She knelt by the base of a moss-covered boulder, her gaze sweeping over the intricate patterns of fallen leaves, her breath soft and even. Her hands, stained with the faint residue of shell lacquer, moved with practiced grace, gently parting the foliage, searching for a flash of iridescent color. It was then that she saw them. Not a single, isolated shell, but a cluster, a bustling community of living beetles nestled amongst the roots of the ancient boulder. There were dozens, perhaps hundreds of them, a slow, continuous movement of life. They were scarab beetles, the kind she knew well, but in their living state, they seemed different. Their movements were clumsy, a bustling, jostling mass of tiny bodies, each one pushing and moving, climbing over another, then tumbling back down into the soft earth. There was no serene stillness here, no perfected elegance. They simply were, in all their raw, untamed activity. Their colors, too, were less vivid than the polished shells she collected. The green of their carapaces, while undeniably present, lacked the deep, almost liquid emerald she achieved with her secret lacquer. The blue seemed flatter, the purple less profound. There were no thousand dancing hues, no silent symphony of fractured light, just the honest, simpler colors of life, slightly muted by the dust of their burrowing, softened by the wear of their ceaseless activity. They were not polished, not preserved, not perfected by human hands or by the stillness of passing. They were simply alive, in the moment, engaged in the mundane, beautiful chaos of their existence. Yet, as she observed them, kneeling there in the dappled light, Tanvi felt an undeniable pull, a profound resonance. There was a vibrant energy to them, a raw, untamed life that pulsed through their clumsy movements. She watched as one beetle, smaller than the rest, struggled to right itself after being overturned, its tiny legs flailing, then finding purchase, slowly, painstakingly, until it was upright once more, joining the bustling throng as if nothing had happened. Another climbed a small dry twig, its progress slow and deliberate, its antennae twitching, sensing the world around it. She heard the soft, almost imperceptible rustle of their movements, the quiet hum of their collective existence. It was a sound of life, immediate and undeniable, a chorus of being that filled the quiet clearing. She found herself comparing them, these bustling, living forms, to the serene, perfected emptiness of the dead shells in her basket in her workshop. The shells, so flawless, so radiant, held a beauty that was fixed, a still portrait of what once was. The living beetles, however, were a moving canvas, a vibrant, if less outwardly polished, testament to the sheer force of being. One was a memory, perfected. The other, a promise, unfolding. The shells, in their quiet perfection, felt like the culmination of a journey, a final, exquisite form. The living beetles were in the midst of their journey, each moment a small, unadorned act of living. And as she watched, a quiet understanding began to dawn within her, settling softly, like the dust motes in the air, finding their resting place. It was not a sudden, blinding flash, but a gentle unfolding, a quiet shift in perception. She saw that sometimes the most profound beauty emerged, not in life's tumultuous dance, not in the raw, untamed energy of being, but in the stillness after it had passed. It emerged in the way light caught an empty form, transforming what was once a vessel of life into a pure, reflective surface, a canvas for the unseen light. The shells she collected were not beautiful, despite their emptiness, but in a new way, because of it. Their emptiness was not a lack, but a transformation, allowing them to hold the light in a way the living, bustling forms never could. The life that once animated them had moved on, yes, but what remained was a testament, a quiet echo, refined by its stillness, made iridescent by the very absence of its former occupant. It was a beauty born of release, a radiance that spoke of what was and what could now be in its quiet, perfected form. And then, softly, the understanding turned inward. Her own perceived emptiness, that quiet ache in the center of her being, that feeling of faded beauty, of being a hollow shell. What if it was not a flaw? What if it was not a loss to be mourned, or a void to be frantically filled? What if it was instead a space, a quiet, receptive capacity, a canvas within her own being, waiting? Perhaps, she mused, her internal stillness, her own perceived absence of the vibrant, bustling life she once felt, was simply creating the perfect conditions. It was creating the space, the quiet, the emptiness that would allow for a new, unexpected iridescence to bloom within her. Not the clamorous outward vibrancy of constant activity, but a deeper, more subtle glow, a radiance that emerged from a profound stillness, from an inner acceptance. Her understanding of beauty began to transform, shifting like the light on a beetle's wing. It was not just in the full, bustling life, nor only in the perfectly preserved form, It was in the journey between them, in the quiet moment of transition, in the inherent capacity of an empty space to catch and reflect a new kind of light. Emptiness, she now saw, was not an ending, but a profound beginning, a rich, open possibility. She stood slowly, her basket still empty of new shells, but her heart feeling strangely full. She looked at the living beetles, bustling and clumsy, and felt a new tenderness, a quiet appreciation for their raw, untamed life. Then, she looked at her hands, the faint stains of lacquer a testament to her craft, and for the first time, she saw them not as merely the tools for preserving external beauty, but as hands capable of recognizing a deeper, more expansive beauty within herself. The ache had not vanished entirely, but it had softened, transformed from a longing into a gentle, open question. What new shimmer, she wondered, would emerge from this quiet, receptive space within her? What unexpected iridescence might yet bloom? The forest around her seemed to hold its breath, a silent witness to her quiet epiphany. And Tanvi, the collector of iridescent beauty, began to turn her gaze inward, ready to discover the luminous possibilities within her own quiet, vast emptiness. The forest around her seemed to hold its breath, a silent witness to her quiet epiphany, and Tanvi, the collector of iridescent beauty, began to turn her gaze inward, ready to discover the luminous possibilities within her own quiet, vast emptiness. As the quiet wisdom settled upon Tanvi in the forest, elsewhere, in the heart of a village nestled by a murmuring river, another soul moved through his days with a different kind of quiet devotion. This was Rishi, the knot untire, a man whose life was measured in the careful loosening of countless tangles. His days began with the first blush of dawn, long before the sun had fully cleared the eastern hills, bringing its warmth to the ancient stone steps of the village temple. He would arrive, his simple white dhoti and kurta always clean, reflecting his dedication to purity and order, his dark hair neatly tied back, a picture of methodical calm. His workspace was not a bustling workshop, but a quiet corner of the temple courtyard, shaded by an old banyan tree whose roots seemed to flow into the very foundations of the sacred building. Here, devotees left their prayer knots, intricately woven strands of thread, often imbued with specific intentions: a prayer for health, a wish for prosperity, a hope for safe travels, a vow of gratitude, a plea for release from sorrow. Each knot was a silent offering, a tangible representation of a heart's deepest yearning, its quiet burden, or its soaring joy. Rishi approached each knot with a reverence born of years of practice and an innate understanding of human devotion. His hands, strong from years of untangling, yet capable of the most delicate touch, moved with a practiced grace. He would pick up a knot, often still warm from the hand that had just placed it, and turn it over, feeling its texture, discerning the tension in its loops, the stubbornness of its intertwining threads. Some were simple, a single, straightforward loop. Others were masterpieces of complexity, a labyrinth of overlapping strands, each twist and turn holding a silent story. He knew that each knot, once untied, symbolized a release. The intention, the prayer, the burden, once held tightly, was now set free, carried by the wind, absorbed by the earth, dispersed into the vast unseen currents of the universe. It was a sacred duty, a quiet service, a daily act of letting go, performed for countless others. His fingers, calloused yet sensitive, understood the language of thread, of tension, of release. He could feel the story held within the fibers, the push and pull of the one who had tied it, the weight of their hopes, the lightness of their faith. He would begin with the outermost loop, gently testing its resistance, coaxing it to yield. Sometimes, a stubborn knot would require patience, a slow, deliberate working of the threads, one by one, until the entire structure softened, relaxed, and finally surrendered. There was no force, no sudden tearing, only a quiet, persistent persuasion, a gentle understanding that every tangle, however complex, had a beginning and an end, a way out. He understood the physics of it, the geometry of it, the quiet philosophy of it. Each untied knot was a small victory, a moment of peaceful completion, a whisper of freedom. Yet, as he meticulously worked, as he released the intentions of others into the universe, Rishi felt a deep internal convolution within himself. It was a tangle of unarticulated worries, a web of unspoken desires, a silent internal frustration that manifested in a slight furrowing of his brow when deep in thought, a subtle tightening around his eyes that even his calm exterior could not entirely mask. He was a master of untangling for others, but his own inner knots remained stubbornly tied, refusing to yield to his practiced touch, his quiet wisdom. He carried these unseen tangles within him like a secret burden, a silent weight that pressed upon his quiet spirit. There were questions about his own purpose, beyond the daily ritual of the knots. There were unspoken longings for a deeper connection, a clearer path, a sense of belonging that felt as elusive as a wisp of smoke. He would reflect on conversations he'd had, words left unsaid, choices made or not made, and they would weave themselves into intricate patterns within his mind, tightening with each revisit, each quiet rumination. He could feel the tension, the resistance, the stubbornness of these inner knots, yet he could not find their beginning, nor their end. He tried, in his own quiet way, to apply his craft to himself. He would spend hours, long after the last devotee had left, not untying the knots of others, but studying them, tracing their intricate paths, hoping to find a mirror, a clue to the pathways of his own inner complexity. He would identify patterns, the overhand knot of a simple worry, the fisherman's bend of a clinging attachment, the figure 8 of a recurring doubt. He would visualize these patterns within himself, trying to apply the same methodical calm, the same gentle persuasion he used on the physical threads. He would close his eyes, imagining his thoughts as strands of silk, his emotions as ropes of jute, all woven together into a dense, unyielding mass in the center of his being. He would try to identify the first loop, the initial thought or feeling that had started the tangle, but it was always too elusive, too deeply embedded. He would attempt to loosen one strand, to release a particular worry, but it seemed only to tighten another, creating a ripple effect of internal resistance. His fingers, so adept with physical thread, felt clumsy, useless, when confronted with the invisible fibers of his own mind. Sometimes, in his quiet moments, he would seek counsel from the temple elders, wise men whose eyes held the calm of long years and deep reflection. He would speak in parables, describing a particularly stubborn knot he had encountered, one that defied all his usual methods, hoping their wisdom might offer a subtle hint, a new perspective. "Sometimes, Rishi," one elder had offered, his voice raspy with age, "the knot is not the problem, but the hand that holds it. Perhaps you seek to untie what is not yet ready to be unbound." Another had mused, "All tangles have a purpose, even if the purpose is to teach patience. Do not rush the thread." Rishi would listen, his head bowed in respect, absorbing their words, turning them over in his mind like smooth river stones. He understood the wisdom. He truly did. He applied these very principles to the countless knots brought to him daily. But his own inner knots felt different. They were not just stubborn, they felt intrinsic, woven into the very fabric of his being. They were not just tangles, they felt like him. He would return to his quiet corner, the words of the elders echoing, but failing to offer the direct key he sought for his internal labyrinth. He would sit, his back straight, his breathing even, and try to meditate on the nature of his inner tangles, allowing them to simply be present, to see if they would soften, would yield under the steady gaze of his awareness. But his mind, like a restless monkey, would dance from one thought to another, one worry to another, weaving new strands, tightening old ones, creating an even denser, more intricate pattern. The quiet ache of this unresolvable convolution remained. It was not a pain that cried out, but a persistent, subtle thrum, a constant reminder of the unseen tangles within. He could untie the knots of devotion, of hope, of sorrow for others, releasing their burdens into the ether. But his own burdens, his own hopes, his own sorrows, remained tightly bound, a silent testament to a frustration that rippled beneath his peaceful exterior, a quiet yearning for an unraveling that seemed eternally out of reach. His days continued, marked by the rhythmic untying of prayer knots, the soft rustle of released threads, the gentle murmur of temple life. But in his heart, Rishi carried his own intricate knot, a complex tapestry of self that he, the master untier, could not fathom, could not loosen, could not set free. And so he waited, patiently, diligently, for a different kind of wisdom, a different kind of understanding that might finally illuminate the hidden pathways of his own sacred tangles. One quiet morning, as the first rays of sun painted the temple courtyard in hues of soft gold and rose, Rishi began his daily ritual. The air was cool, carrying the scent of damp earth and yesterday's incense. He moved with his usual measured grace, his white dhoti rustling softly as he knelt before the pile of offerings, his hands reaching for the first knot of the day. He expected the familiar, the commonplace, the tangles of ordinary human wishes and woes that had passed through his fingers for decades. But this morning, something was different. Beneath a small, faded garland of jasmine, nestled among offerings of rice and marigolds, lay a prayer knot unlike any he had ever encountered. It was not merely complex, it was a testament to a lifetime of devotion, a masterpiece of intricate weaving, each strand seemingly imbued with a quiet, ancient power. The threads were not the usual bright, ephemeral silks, but strands of aged hand-spun cotton, dyed with natural pigments that had softened with time: deep indigo, earth red, forest green, muted saffron. They were thicker, more resilient, yet woven with such extraordinary precision that the entire structure held a dense, almost sculptural quality. Rishi picked it up, feeling its weight, its history. It was a knot that spoke of generations, of patient hands, of countless prayers whispered over each twist and turn. Layers upon layers of devotion had been meticulously bound, each loop secured with a deliberate, knowing touch. There were braids within braids, hidden crossings, and interlocking patterns that seemed to defy the very laws of tension and release he had come to master. It was a labyrinth of faith, a silent chronicle of an enduring spirit, a sacred geometry of yearning. It pulsed with a quiet energy, not frantic, but deep, resonant, as if the very essence of its maker's soul was held within its intricate embrace. His usual calm began to ripple, not with frustration, but with a profound sense of awe, and then a subtle challenge. He recognized the techniques. Yes, some of them, ancient methods rarely seen in his time, but they were combined in ways that rendered his practiced approach suddenly inadequate. He tested the outermost loop, as was his custom, but it held firm, unyielding, as if it had been woven into the very fabric of time itself. There was no give, no subtle slackening, no whisper of release. He tried another point, then another, his fingers, so adept at deciphering resistance, finding only an impenetrable unity. Hours passed. The golden light of morning deepened, then brightened to the clear, sharp light of noon. The temple hummed with the gentle activity of devotees, but Rishi remained in his quiet corner, utterly absorbed. He turned the knot in his hands, examining it from every angle, tracing its pathways with his eyes, then with the tips of his fingers, seeking an opening, a weakness, a beginning to its unraveling. He applied all his known methods, the gentle coaxing, the subtle pressure, the slow, deliberate untwisting. He tried to visualize the threads yielding, softening, releasing their hold, but the knot remained resolute, a silent monument to its own intricate perfection. It was as if the knot itself possessed a will, a quiet, unwavering refusal to be undone. His years of experience, his quiet wisdom, his meticulous patience, all seemed to break against its unyielding form. The subtle frustration that usually rippled beneath his peaceful exterior, the familiar tightening around his eyes when confronted with his own internal tangles, began to rise more keenly now. This external knot, so utterly resistant, felt like a mirror to those unseen convolutions within himself, those stubborn patterns that refused to yield to his introspection, his meditation, his quiet pleading. If he could not untie this, what hope was there for the invisible tangles of his own heart? He felt the familiar ache of his own unresolvable questions resurface, the silent weight of his internal knots pressing upon his spirit. He had sought to understand them, to loosen them, to find their beginning and their end, just as he sought to do with every physical knot placed before him. But this knot, this ancient sacred tangle, seemed to mock his very purpose, his very skill. He put it down gently, his hands resting on the cool stone, his gaze fixed upon its intricate form. His usual methodical calm had given way to a quiet bewilderment, a sense of having reached the very limits of his craft, his understanding. The sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows across the courtyard. The temple grew quieter, the last devotees departing. Rishi remained, not moving, not attempting, simply observing. He did not pick up the knot again. He did not try to force it, or even to visualize its surrender. He simply sat before it, allowing his breath to deepen, softly, slowly, allowing his mind to settle. He watched the interplay of light and shadow on its woven surface, the subtle shifts in color as the day faded, the way the threads seemed to hold the very essence of the dying light. He began to see it differently then, not as a problem to be solved, not as a challenge to his skill, but as a presence, a silent, enduring presence. He saw how each strand supported another, how each loop was essential to the whole, how the very act of binding had created something greater than its individual parts. It was not a knot tied in haste or in fleeting hope, but a knot woven with intention, with lasting devotion, with a profound understanding of what it meant to hold. In that profound stillness, as twilight deepened around him, a new understanding began to settle upon him, as gentle and pervasive as the evening mist. He realized that he had approached this knot, as he had approached all knots, with the singular purpose of release, of untangling, of setting free. But what if release was not the only purpose? What if some knots were not meant to be untied at all? He looked at the intricate weave, no longer with the eyes of a craftsman seeking to unravel, but with the eyes of a pilgrim contemplating a sacred artifact. He saw that the very tangle itself was the prayer. The very holding was the devotion. The layers were not obstacles to be overcome, but testaments to enduring faith, to a precious bond, to a story that needed to be held, not released. This knot was not a burden to be lightened, but a sacred vessel, perfectly preserving the intentions woven into its very core. Its complexity was not a flaw, but its strength, its profound beauty. A quiet warmth spread through Rishi's chest, a feeling of deep peace he had not known for a long time. The realization was not a sudden burst of light, but a gentle, unfolding understanding. Like a lotus opening its petals in the morning sun, he had spent his life untying, believing that freedom lay always in unraveling. But true freedom, he now understood, could also be found in acceptance, in allowing, in recognizing that some complexities, some tangles, some sacred bonds were meant to simply be. They were not problems to be fixed, but truths to be honored, their inherent sacredness residing in their very holding. And as he looked at this ancient, untieable knot, he saw his own internal convolutions in a new light. His unarticulated worries, his unspoken desires, his own intricate patterns of self. Perhaps they too were not meant to be unraveled, to be smoothed out into a single, simple strand. Perhaps they were part of the sacred tapestry of his own being, holding something precious, something essential, something that defied easy release. The subtle ache of his unresolvable questions began to soften, to transform. It was not a pain that cried out, but a quiet hum of acceptance, a gentle knowing. He did not need to untie his internal knots to find peace. He needed only to sit with them, to observe them, to recognize their inherent sacredness, their silent stories, their enduring presence. He could allow them to simply be, trusting that their very tangle held a meaning, a wisdom that his striving hands and logical mind could not grasp. Rishi left the intricate knot where it lay, not in defeat, but in quiet reverence. He knew it would remain, a silent teaching, a gentle reminder. He returned to his simple dwelling, the night air cool on his skin, a new spaciousness within his heart. His hands, so accustomed to the work of untangling, now felt a different kind of strength, a deeper kind of peace. He had learned that true release was not always about loosening every thread, but about accepting the beautiful, complex, sacred tangles that life, and indeed the self, sometimes chose to weave. He had found a different kind of freedom, not in unraveling, but in the quiet, profound act of letting things simply remain. Rishi had found a quiet peace, a new spaciousness within his heart, accepting the sacred tangles that remained. But in another corner of the same world, where the cycle of life completed its final, solemn turn, there was another soul, equally diligent, equally precise, who moved through a very different kind of stillness, and who carried a very different kind of silent burden. Her name was Devi. Devi, in her late 30s, moved with a quiet precision amidst the solemnity of the cremation grounds. Her movements were deliberate, each sift of the ash a testament to her care in separating what remained. Her strong, slender hands, often smudged with fine gray dust, were her tools, extensions of her unwavering dedication. Her dark, braided hair was usually covered with a simple cloth, protecting it from the fine, pervasive powder that settled on everything. Her eyes held a steady, observant quality, rarely betraying the deep, internal sifting she felt she performed on her own life, finding nothing of value. She was a woman of few words, her presence a silent, respectful testament to her duty, a quiet observer of endings. Each morning, before the sun climbed too high, Devi would approach the cooling pyre, her basket of sieves and brushes in hand. The air, though cleansed by fire, still held the faint, earthy scent of wood smoke and dissolution. She would kneel on the cool stone, her back straight, her gaze focused. The task was always the same, yet always unique in its details, just as each life had been unique. She would gather the ashes carefully, reverently, into her widest sieve. The first sifting was always the coarsest, separating the larger fragments, remnants of the pyre wood, perhaps a larger piece of bone that had resisted the flames, or a larger ornament of metal. Her hands moved with a practiced, rhythmic grace, shaking the sieve gently, allowing the finer particles to fall through onto a clean sheet of cloth spread beneath. The sound was soft, a rustle of ash, a whisper of grit, a metallic clink now and then. Then came the second sieve, finer still. With this, she would sift again, breaking down the clumps, teasing out smaller fragments of bone, tiny beads of melted gold or silver, minuscule remnants of what had once adorned a body or been placed with intention on the pyre. Her eyes, accustomed to discerning the smallest details in the monochromatic landscape of ash, would search for these treasures, these enduring fragments. She found them, always. A tiny ring, a delicate earring, a shard of a bone ornament, each piece holding a story, a connection to a life lived, a love remembered, a value once placed. She would gather these findings into small, separate bowls, one for the bone fragments, destined to be scattered in the sacred river, another for the precious metals, to be cleaned and returned to the family, or offered to the temple. Devi never kept anything for herself. Her duty was one of meticulous separation, of respectful return, of finding and honoring the distinct elements that remained. But as she performed this solemn duty, day after quiet day, Devi felt as though she was performing a similar sifting within herself, sifting through the ashes of her own life. She too searched for something of lasting value, something worth keeping, something that had endured the fires of her own experiences, her own quiet struggles. She would mentally retrace her days, her years, her choices. Like the coarser sieve, she would begin with the larger events, the moments that seemed significant, a childhood memory, a word spoken, a path chosen. She would shake these memories gently, trying to discern their essence, their meaning, their enduring contribution to who she was. But often, what fell through was just a fine gray dust, the mundane, the forgotten, the unremarkable. The larger forms, the distinct fragments, seemed to crumble into inconsequentiality upon closer inspection. Then, like the finer sieve, she would turn her attention to the smaller moments, the subtle interactions, the fleeting feelings. She would sift through her quiet observations, her unspoken thoughts, the gentle rhythms of her daily existence. She searched for a glint of gold, a shard of enduring worth, a precious metal of spirit within her own perceived emptiness. She sought a moment of profound joy that had lasted, a memory of fierce courage that had shaped her, a feeling of deep belonging that had settled within her. She would look for the things that had truly remained, unburnt, untarnished, after the flames of time and circumstance had passed over her. She used finer and finer sieves of introspection, sifting more carefully, her mind's gaze sharp, keen, unyielding. She spent longer periods in quiet contemplation, searching deeper beyond the surface, beyond the obvious. A quiet desperation, almost imperceptible to anyone else, drove her. It was not a frantic search, but a persistent, almost weary quest for a treasure she felt certain must exist within her. If only she could sift finely enough, patiently enough. But the perceived treasure of her own worth eluded her. She found no glinting metals of self-worth, no enduring fragments of a singular, undeniable purpose. She found only ash, fine, pervasive gray ash, a sense of emptiness, a feeling that all that remained of her own life was fleeting, indistinguishable, lacking in any unique or lasting value. Her daily work, which so clearly defined and organized the remnants of others, seemed only to amplify her own internal disarray, her own sense of unfoundness. She could identify the bone, the metal, the dust, and assign them their rightful place. But within herself, she felt only the dust, the undifferentiated mass, the absence of distinct, precious fragments. She yearned for that clarity, that sense of having something valuable, something uniquely her own, that had endured. The sun would continue its arc, casting long, then shortening, then lengthening shadows across the cremation ground. Devi would continue her work, her hands moving with the same quiet precision, her breathing deep and even. Outwardly, she was a picture of serene dedication, a woman fulfilling her sacred duty with unwavering focus. Inwardly, however, the sifting continued, endlessly, tirelessly. She would often sit for a while after her work was done, the sorted piles neatly arranged before her, the tools cleaned and put away. She would watch the wind play with the remaining unsifted dust, lifting it, swirling it, carrying it across the vast open space. She would watch it settle, indistinguishable from the earth itself, and a deep sigh, barely audible, would escape her lips. A sigh of quiet despair, a resignation to the pervasive gray that seemed to define her own internal landscape. She had tried everything she knew. She had sought wisdom in the quiet teachings of the elders, but their words, though comforting, did not reveal the specific, tangible value she sought within her own being. She had looked for signs in the patterns of nature, but the endless cycles of growth and decay seemed only to reinforce the impermanence, the eventual return to dust. She had meditated, she had prayed, she had observed her own thoughts and feelings with a relentless scrutiny, as fine as her finest sieve. But the emptiness remained, the sense that her own life, once lived, would leave behind no precious metals, no distinct bone fragments, nothing truly valuable for another to gather and honor. Just a vast, undifferentiated expanse of fine gray ash, indistinguishable from all the rest, returning to nothingness. She saw the families who came to collect the bones of their loved ones, the small, treasured ornaments. She saw their grief, but also their quiet sense of continuity, their connection to what remained. She saw the value they placed on these remnants, these tangible symbols of a life. And then she would turn her gaze inward, and the quiet despair would deepen. For whom would she sift? What fragments would remain of her own journey? What value, what lasting worth could possibly be found within the quiet, unassuming dust of her own existence? Devi continued her days, her sifting hands moving with unwavering precision, her observant eyes missing nothing in the physical world. But in the quiet, unseen chambers of her own heart, the sifting continued, endlessly, tirelessly, and the perceived treasure of her own worth remained elusive, hidden beneath layers of fine, gray dust, an echo of emptiness in the solemn air. She waited for a sign, a glint, a resonance, but only the soft rustle of ash answered her silent, internal call. Only the pervasive gray, only the sense of a profound, unyielding absence. And so, she continued to sift, each movement a quiet prayer, each gesture a silent question, each day a relentless search for a value she could not find, a treasure that refused to reveal itself amidst the quiet dissolution. The sun would rise, the sun would set, and Devi would sift, hoping, always hoping, that one day she might find something more than just the silent, all-encompassing gray. The sun had begun its slow descent, painting the western sky in hues of soft orange and fading rose, but Devi remained. She had finished her sifting for the day, her strong, slender hands having moved with their accustomed, quiet precision. Before her, on the smooth, sun-warmed stone, lay the distinct, carefully separated piles. To her left, the small, hard fragments of bone, each a testament to a life once lived, now a tangible link to memory. In the center, the glinting specks of metal, ornaments and unexpected treasures, remnants that had endured the intense heat, solid and unyielding. And to her right, the vastest pile, the fine, pervasive gray ash, soft as silk, light as a whisper, the essence of all that had returned to dust. She looked at her work, the clean lines, the clear distinctions. This ordering, this separation, was her sacred duty, her silent contribution to the cycle of farewell. It brought a certain calm to the cremation ground, a sense of quiet closure for those who sought their loved ones' remains. Yet, as she gazed upon the perfect order, the familiar ache returned, the quiet despair that had settled deep within her. She saw the bone, the metal, the ash, each with its place, its identity. But when she turned her gaze inward, she still found only the ash, the undifferentiated mass, the absence of distinct, precious fragments within her own perceived existence. Her own life, she felt, was just the dust, formless, indistinguishable, lacking in any unique or lasting value. She sat for a long while, her breathing deep and even, her presence a silent, respectful testament to her duty. The air was still, carrying only the distant murmur of the river, the whisper of wind through the ancient trees that ring the grounds. The scent of wood smoke, faint and lingering, hung gently in the air, a reminder of the fires that had purified and transformed. Devi was accustomed to this stillness, this quiet. It was in these moments that her internal sifting often intensified, her mind moving with the same tireless precision as her hands, searching, always searching, for something more. But today, something was subtly different. A faint breath stirred the air, a movement almost imperceptible. It was not the strong, purposeful gust of a coming storm, but a gentle sigh, a soft exhalation across the land. It touched her cheek, cool and fleeting, then moved on, rustling the dry leaves at the edge of the stone. Devi noticed it, but did not move. It was merely the wind, a frequent visitor to this open space. Then, a second breath, a little stronger, a little more playful. It danced across the ground, lifting a single dry leaf into a brief, twirling ascent before letting it fall. It stirred the very top layer of the largest pile, the fine gray ash, creating tiny, ephemeral ripples on its surface. Devi watched, her eyes steady, observant. Her work was done. The piles were separated. The wind could not undo the essence of her labor, only rearrange its surface. But the wind, as if emboldened by its own gentle power, grew. It was not harsh, not violent, but gathered strength with an almost deliberate grace. It swept through the cremation ground, not with a roar, but with a rising whisper, a soft, insistent murmur that seemed to fill the quiet spaces between the trees. It lifted the light ash, not in a chaotic explosion, but in a gentle, swirling dance. Devi watched, transfixed. The fine gray dust, previously so still, so neatly contained in its separated pile, began to rise. It did not fly away in a single desperate rush. Instead, it ascended in delicate spirals, in soft, ethereal plumes, catching the fading light of the afternoon sun. Each tiny particle seemed to glitter, to shimmer, reflecting the light in a way it never had while resting in its static heap. The wind was not destroying. It was animating. The swirling ash began to mix, first with itself, then with the air, becoming one with the very breath of the wind. It was carried not far, but just enough to soften the edges of the other piles, the bone and the metal. A fine silvery veil settled over the distinct fragments, dusting them with a layer of gray. It was as if the ash, previously confined, was reaching out, embracing, mingling with all that was around it. Devi felt a subtle shift within her, a quiet tremor of recognition. Her meticulously separated piles, the very definition of her work, were dissolving. The sharp lines she had created were blurring, softening, yielding to the natural force. Her fingers, which had so precisely performed the act of separation, now lay still, resting on the stone. There was no impulse to gather the ash, to resist the wind's gentle insistence. She simply watched, her gaze unwavering, her breath held in a silent, profound observation. The wind continued its playful dance, swirling the ash higher, wider, blending it with the loose earth, with the dried grass, with the unseen dust that always settled across the grounds. It was not a violent dispersal, but a slow, deliberate interweaving. The ash, which she had so carefully isolated, was returning. It was returning to the ground from which it had come, returning to the air that carried it, returning to the vast, undifferentiated embrace of the earth. And in that moment, as the last rays of the sun dipped below the distant hills, painting the swirling dust in a final golden glow, a profound understanding bloomed within Devi. It was not a sudden, startling revelation, but a gentle unfolding, like a flower opening slowly to the morning light. She realized that separation, this meticulous sifting, this careful ordering into distinct piles, bone, metal, ash, was a human construct. It was an act of the mind, a way to understand, to categorize, to bring a sense of control to the vastness of existence. But it was temporary. Nature, in its boundless wisdom, did not separate. Nature returned everything to mixture. The wind, that playful, insistent breath, was not undoing her work in a destructive way, but completing it, returning it to its inherent natural state. The ash was not meant to remain distinct, a testament to its singular nature. It was meant to blend, to nourish, to become part of the soil, part of the air, part of the endless cycle of growth and decay, of becoming and unbecoming. The value, she now understood with a quiet clarity that settled deep within her bones, was not in what remained distinct or separate. It was not in the isolated fragment, however precious, however enduring. The true value lay in how things mixed, in how the ash, once the remnant of fire, now mingled with the earth, enriching it, flowing into it, contributing to the vast, ongoing cycle of existence. It was in the interconnectedness, the fluid, ceaseless dance of all elements returning to one another, becoming part of a greater whole. Her own life, she realized, was not a pile of ash to be sifted for enduring fragments of unique worth. It was not a collection of isolated moments, each to be judged for its individual value. Her life, like the ash, was meant to mix. It was meant to flow. It was meant to contribute to the vast, ongoing cycle of existence, not as a distinct, separate entity, but as an integral part of the whole. The perceived emptiness she had felt within herself, the sense that all that remained was fleeting and indistinguishable, began to transform. It was not an absence, she now saw, but a capacity for mixing, for blending, for becoming part of something larger. Her own fine gray dust was not a symbol of worthlessness, but a potent, vital element, ready to enrich, to nourish, to flow. Her value was not in being a separate bone fragment or a glinting piece of metal, distinct and apart. Her value was in her essence, in her ability to merge, to connect, to contribute, however subtly, to the tapestry of life. The wind softened, its playful dance subsiding. The last of the swirling ash settled, not back into its neat pile, but across the stone, across the earth, a thin, silvery dusting that unified all that lay beneath it. Devi's hands, which had previously held the sieves, now rested open, palms upward, a gesture of quiet acceptance. The sigh that escaped her lips was no longer one of despair, but of release, of a profound, encompassing peace. The silence that followed was different now. It was not the echoing silence of emptiness, but a vast, embracing spaciousness, filled with the quiet murmur of interconnectedness. Her duty at the cremation ground, once a solemn task of separation, now felt like a sacred dance of return, of allowing all things to flow back to their source, to mingle and become one. She would still sift, she knew, for it was her duty to the families, to the living. But her heart would hold a new understanding, a new wisdom. The sun had fully set, and the first stars began to prickle the deepening indigo sky. Devi rose, her movements slow, deliberate, yet lighter than they had been. She left the now blended remnants, allowing the wind and the night to continue their work of gentle integration. She walked away from the cremation ground, no longer searching for a hidden treasure within herself, but simply allowing her own life, her own being, to mix, to flow, to contribute, like the pervasive, beautiful ash, to the vast, unending cycle of all that is. Her journey was not about finding, but about becoming, about recognizing the inherent value in the soft, quiet dance of mixture. The sun, now fully set, had yielded its light to the deepening indigo of the sky. The wind, which had danced with the ash, now whispered a quiet farewell, carrying with it the scent of earth and spent embers. Devi's journey had found its gentle conclusion, a deep peace settling where once there had been only searching. And as the world turned, as one story found its quiet resolution, another began to stir, softly, in a different corner of this timeless land. In a village nestled at the edge of a bustling forest, where the air often rang with the cheerful chatter of monkeys, lived Lada, the wife of a man renowned for his skill in training these agile creatures. Her days, too, were filled with the monkeys. Though her role was one of gentle care rather than command, she moved through her small, sun-dappled courtyard with a quiet grace, her hands familiar with the textures of ripe fruit and fresh leaves, preparing the daily meals for the troop. Her soft, dark eyes missed nothing, observing each monkey's unique preferences, the way one preferred the sweetest mango, another the crunchiest banana, how a smaller one might snatch a morsel from a larger's grasp with lightning speed. Lata understood the monkeys. She understood their playful antics, their quick bursts of energy, their sudden moments of stillness. She watched them learn, watched them repeat the routines her husband taught them, the intricate dances, the clever tricks, the disciplined leaps and catches. They moved with an almost startling precision, each motion a testament to countless hours of patient training. And as she watched them, day in and day out, a subtle unease often stirred within her, a quiet yearning that she rarely acknowledged, even to herself. It was a feeling, not of sadness, but of a quiet resonance, a deep, unspoken kinship with the very creatures she tended. She saw their disciplined routines, their practiced motions, and felt, sometimes, that her own life mirrored theirs. Her days, too, felt like a series of practiced motions, a sequence of duties performed with quiet diligence. She woke with the first light, prepared the morning meal, tended the small garden, mended clothes, offered water to thirsty travelers, always with the same gentle rhythm, the same unassuming grace. But beneath this outward calm, Lada carried the subtle burden of an unchosen path, a quiet sense that she too was performing, trained to routines she had never consciously selected, her steps guided by an invisible hand. Her husband, a kind and dedicated man, loved his work, and Lada loved him. There was no overt constraint, no harsh demand, no visible chain, yet the feeling persisted, a whisper in the quiet chambers of her heart, that she was moving through a life that had been laid out for her, a predetermined dance, much like the monkeys who performed for the amusement of onlookers. She would watch them, leaping through hoops, balancing on ropes, their movements fluid and seemingly free, yet born of countless repetitions, of gentle persuasion, of subtle guidance. And she would wonder, with a quiet ache, if her own perceived freedom was equally illusory, if her steps, however graceful, were simply the result of invisible training, a mimicry of the life around her. She began, subtly, to test the boundaries of this invisible training, not with rebellion, for Lada was not one for sudden movements or loud declarations. Her attempts were as quiet and as understated as her own presence. One morning, instead of taking the usual path to the river to fetch water, a path worn smooth by generations of feet, she chose a slightly different route, one that wound through a patch of wild jasmine, its scent heavy and sweet in the cool air. It was a small deviation, barely noticeable, yet to Lada, it felt like a silent assertion, a tiny ripple in the placid surface of her routine. She felt a faint flutter of something akin to excitement, a tiny spark of agency in the simple act of choosing a different way. Another day, as she prepared the monkey's midday fruit, she found herself lingering over a particularly vibrant hibiscus flower that had bloomed in her courtyard. Usually, she would simply admire its fleeting beauty before returning to her task. But this day, she plucked it, tucking it gently behind her ear, its soft petals a bright splash against her dark hair. It was a preference, a small act of self-adornment, chosen purely for her own quiet pleasure, not for any expectation or duty. The flower, she noticed, felt cool against her skin, a small anchor in the flow of her day. It was a tiny declaration, a gentle whisper of her own desire, not for the monkeys, not for her husband, but for herself. She tried to vary her patterns, to introduce small, almost imperceptible changes into the fabric of her days. Instead of mending the torn cloak immediately, she might leave it for an hour, allowing herself to sit in the shade of the banyan tree, simply observing the play of light and shadow. Instead of serving the usual lentil stew for the evening meal, she might add an unexpected spice, a new vegetable, a subtle shift in flavor. Each small variation was an attempt to loosen the invisible threads that seemed to bind her, to assert a quiet will where she felt none existed. She wanted to feel the freedom of conscious choice, to know that her actions stemmed not from rote, but from a deeper internal prompting. Yet, Despite these quiet experiments, the subtle yearning persisted. The invisible training she found was deeply ingrained. Her hands, accustomed to years of routine, would often move almost automatically, reaching for the familiar tools, performing the accustomed tasks. The path through the jasmine, though beautiful, often felt like a detour rather than a true alternative. The hibiscus, though lovely, would eventually wilt, and the routines would reassert themselves like water finding its own level. She would watch the monkeys, still. She would observe their dedication, their effortless execution of learned behaviors, and she would feel a quiet frustration, a subtle tightening in her chest. If even a wild creature could be so thoroughly trained, so completely guided into a particular way of being, then how much more susceptible was a human heart, a human mind, to the unseen patterns of life? How could one truly break free from the invisible training, from the habits of thought and action that had woven themselves so deeply into the very fiber of one's being? Lada yearned to choose her own steps, truly, to dance a dance that was entirely her own, unchoreographed by the expectations of the world, by the subtle dictates of habit. But the freedom she sought remained elusive, a shimmering mirage just beyond her grasp. She tried to locate the source of this invisible training, to find the master who had taught her, the hand that had guided her into these unchosen steps. But there was no master, no hand, only the pervasive, gentle insistence of life itself, flowing around her, through her, shaping her. She would spend long moments in quiet contemplation, her gaze drifting from the bustling monkeys to the distant hills, to the vast open sky. What was freedom? Was it the absence of all routine, the shedding of all patterns? Or was it something deeper, something that lay not in the outward act, but in the inner recognition? The questions lingered, unspoken, unanswered, a subtle hum beneath the surface of her calm exterior. Her attempts to subtly vary her patterns, to assert these small preferences, were like tiny boats launched onto a vast, flowing river. They offered momentary diversions, small eddies in the current, but the river itself continued its steady, unwavering course. She was still Lada, the gentle wife of the monkey trainer, still moving with quiet grace through her days, still performing her duties with calm dedication. The invisible training remained, a silent, pervasive presence, shaping her steps, guiding her hands, whispering the familiar patterns into her heart. The sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and rose. The monkeys, their daily training complete, settled into their evening rituals, their chatter softening into contented murmurs. Lada, having finished her tasks, sat on the small stone bench in her courtyard, the scent of jasmine from her earlier detour still faint in the air. She closed her eyes, allowing the sounds of the evening to wash over her. The distant call of a bird, the rustle of leaves, the soft, contented sighs of the monkeys. She had tried, in her quiet way, to find a path to freedom, to break free from the unchosen steps. But the grasp of the invisible training was subtle, pervasive, and deeply rooted. And as the stars began to appear, one by one, in the deepening sky, Lada still felt the quiet yearning, the subtle ache of a life lived, perhaps, through the practiced motions of another's design, still searching for the key to unlock her own, truly chosen dance. The sun, as it always did, climbed slowly above the eastern hills, casting long, slender shadows across the training ground. It was a familiar scene, one Lada had witnessed countless mornings, a rhythm etched deep into the fabric of her days. Her husband, with his quiet commands and patient gestures, moved among the troop of monkeys, guiding them through their intricate routines. There was the delicate balancing act, the careful retrieval of small scattered seeds, the precise leap from one perch to another. Each movement was a testament to hours of practice, to the gentle persuasion of repetition, to the shaping of instinct into disciplined grace. Lada, as was her custom, sat a little apart in the dappled shade of a mango tree, her hands busy with mending a torn piece of cloth. But her gaze, though seemingly focused on the needle and thread, rarely strayed from the lively tableau before her. She watched the monkeys with an almost meditative intensity, observing their quick intelligence, their playful deviations, and their eventual return to the practiced steps. She noted the subtle flick of a tail, the bright gleam in an eye, the hesitant pause before a perfect execution. And as she watched, the familiar questions would stir within her, a quiet undercurrent beneath the surface of her calm. Were these creatures truly free in their disciplined movements? Or were they merely reflections of their training, their spontaneity channeled into a prescribed dance? Her husband's voice was a low, steady murmur, a constant presence, encouraging, correcting, affirming. The monkeys responded with an almost uncanny precision, their bodies fluid, their minds alert. It was a dance of communication, a silent pact between trainer and trained, a testament to what consistent, gentle guidance could achieve. And in watching, Lada often felt a resonance, a subtle echo within her own being. She, too, moved through her days with a certain practiced grace, her hands knowing the familiar tasks, her feet treading the accustomed paths. Was her life, then, merely a more elaborate, more subtly disguised form of this same training? Was she, too, performing routines learned, not from a direct command, but from the invisible shaping of her world? The morning deepened, the air growing warmer, thick with the scent of dust and ripening fruit. The training session reached its peak, the monkeys performing a particularly complex sequence of jumps and catches, their movements swift and synchronous. It was then, amidst the focused intensity of the training, that a rustle in the dense foliage at the edge of the clearing drew Lata's attention. It was a sound out of place, a subtle disruption in the familiar symphony of the morning. A moment later, a small, dark shape emerged from the shadows of the trees. It was a monkey, smaller than those in her husband's troop, its fur rougher, its movements less refined. Its eyes, wide and curious, darted around the clearing, taking in the scene with an untamed alertness. It was a wild one, clearly, drawn by the sounds of the trained animals, by the unexpected clamor of their disciplined play. It hesitated for a moment, perched on a low branch, its head cocked, observing. Lada watched it, her needle pausing in midair. Her husband, engrossed in his work, had not yet noticed the intruder. The trained monkeys, however, seemed to sense its presence, their movements faltering slightly, a subtle ripple of awareness passing through the troop. They cast quick glances towards the wild newcomer, their expressions a mix of curiosity and mild apprehension. The wild monkey, after its brief moment of hesitation, did something extraordinary. It dropped lightly to the ground, its movements fluid and unburdened by any visible restraint, and then, as if by some unspoken invitation, it began to move. It was not a chaotic random movement, but something altogether more surprising. It began to mimic. It watched one of the trained monkeys perform a delicate balance on a thin rope, its eyes following every subtle shift of weight, every precise placement of foot. And then, with an astonishing lack of effort, the wild monkey found a similar branch, slightly thicker perhaps, but still challenging. It mounted the branch, and with an almost perfect replication, began to balance, its small body swaying with an identical rhythm, its gaze fixed with the same intense concentration. Lotta felt a gasp catch in her throat, unspoken. Her hands stilled completely. She watched, her eyes wide with a sudden, profound fascination. The wild monkey had received no commands, no gentle prods, no patient repetitions. It had simply observed, and in that observation, it had absorbed, it had internalized, it had begun to train itself. One of the trained monkeys was practicing a series of swift leaps between two closely set posts, snatching a piece of fruit from the air with practiced ease. The wild monkey, still observing, moved to a nearby pair of trees. It watched the trajectory, the timing, the arc of the jump, and then, with a burst of untamed energy, it launched itself, not quite as gracefully perhaps, not with the same polished precision, but with an unmistakable intent to replicate. It missed the fruit, but landed with a triumphant chatter, its eyes still bright with the joy of imitation. Lotta watched the untaught animal absorb and replicate the learned behaviors. It was a silent lesson unfolding before her very eyes, a living demonstration of a truth she had been circling for so long. The wild monkey was not being told what to do. It was choosing to do it. It was choosing to mimic. It was choosing to learn, not from a master's hand, but from the simple, undeniable power of observation. Her own heart began to beat with a new, quiet rhythm. She thought of her own daily patterns, the paths she walked, the meals she prepared, the words she spoke. She had felt them as impositions, as the subtle dictates of an unseen hand, a life choreographed for her. But what if, she now wondered, what if she had been the one doing the choreographing all along? What if she had been the wild monkey, observing the world around her and simply, unconsciously, choosing to mimic? The thought was both startling and liberating. Her routines, she realized, might not be imposed training, but rather deeply ingrained, self-chosen mimicry. She had watched her mother, her grandmother, the women of her village. She had observed their quiet grace, their diligent hands, their patient devotion to daily tasks, and she, in her own subtle way, had absorbed those patterns. She had replicated them. She had, in essence, trained herself to become the woman she was, not because she was forced, but because she had observed, and in observing, had made those patterns her own. The unseen master she had sought, the hand that had guided her into these unchosen steps, was not external. It was within her. It was her own capacity for observation, her own deep-seated desire to belong, to move in harmony with the world around her. She had been so focused on the idea of being trained that she had overlooked the profound truth of self-training. A new path to freedom began to unfurl within her mind, not a path of rebellion or dramatic departure, but a path of conscious awareness. If her steps were self-chosen mimicry, then the key to freedom lay not in breaking free from an external trainer, but in becoming fully aware of her own internal choices. It was about seeing the patterns, acknowledging them, and then, with conscious intent, deciding which pattern she truly wished to continue, and which she might gently, softly, begin to reweave. The wild monkey, having exhausted its mimicry, gave a final, triumphant chatter, and then, as suddenly as it had appeared, darted back into the cover of the trees, leaving behind only the lingering scent of wildness and the echo of its astonishing lesson. Lotta sat very still, her mending forgotten in her lap. The sun now shone directly overhead, warming her face. The monkeys continued their training, their movements regaining their usual precision, the temporary disruption having passed. But for Lotta, something fundamental had shifted. The frustration she had felt, the subtle tightening in her chest, began to loosen. It was not a sudden, dramatic release, but a gentle untangling, like a stubborn knot finally yielding to patient fingers. She had been searching for an external key, a way to unlock herself from a perceived cage. But the cage, she now understood, was woven from her own unnoticed observations, her own unconscious choices to follow the familiar, to replicate the seen. And the key, therefore, was not to be found outside, but within, in the quiet, piercing light of self-awareness. Her daily patterns, the routines she had felt bound by, now appeared in a different light. They were not chains, but threads, woven by her own hand, guided by her own gaze. And if she had woven them, then she also held the subtle power to reweave them, to introduce new colors, new textures, new patterns, not out of rebellion, but out of a deep, conscious choice. The freedom she had yearned for was not the absence of all patterns, but the conscious choice of patterns. It was the awareness that even the most deeply ingrained habits began with a single observation, a single act of mimicry, and with that awareness, the possibility of a truly chosen dance, a melody entirely her own, began to shimmer into existence. She picked up her mending again, her fingers moving with a newfound lightness. The thread passed through the fabric, in and out, a familiar rhythm, but now imbued with a different meaning. Each stitch was a conscious act, a deliberate choice, not an unthinking repetition. The world around her remained the same, the bustling monkeys, the patient trainer, the familiar sounds of the village. But Lotta herself had changed. She had found the invisible master, and that master was herself. And in that quiet recognition, a profound and gentle freedom began to bloom. A freedom not from the world, but within it. A freedom born of simply seeing, simply knowing, simply choosing. She was no longer just performing. She was observing her performance, and in that observation, she was becoming truly free. In the quiet tapestry of life, where each soul weaves its own intricate thread, there lived, not far from Lotta's village, an old man named Mahesh. His face, a landscape etched with the gentle hand of time, told its own story, crisscrossed with faint scars that spoke of a lifetime lived deeply, fully. Mahesh was no ordinary elder. He was known far and wide for an extraordinary gift, a unique wisdom that allowed him to see beyond the surface of things. He was a scar reader. People from distant villages, burdened by uncertainty, sought him out. They would come to him, their hands, their faces, their arms offered with a hesitant hope, displaying the marks left by life's trials, a childhood fall, a burn from a hearth fire, the deep line of an old wound from a careless tool. Mahesh would take their hands, his aged fingers, themselves bearing the faint, unyielding evidence of years, tracing the faint lines, the raised ridges, the subtle depressions on their skin. His touch was always gentle, light as a falling feather, yet imbued with a profound reverence for the stories held within the flesh. His eyes, though aged, held a deep, knowing twinkle, a soft luminescence that seemed to pierce through the skin, not to wound, but to understand. He would gaze at the intricate tapestry of their scars, and in those silent etchings, he would see. He would see the intricate patterns of their past, the moments of pain, of resilience, of unexpected turning points. And from these memories, these silent witnesses of survival, he would read their futures. He would speak in soft, low tones, his voice carrying the weight of ancient wisdom, not predicting with certainty, but revealing the inclinations, the possibilities, the gentle paths that unfolded from the crucible of their experiences. He saw how a scar from a hasty cut might signify a future of careful, deliberate hands, how a burn mark might speak of a life warmed by the wisdom of caution, how the fading outline of a deep gash could foretell a future healed by compassion and understanding. For Mahesh, scars were not blemishes. They were narratives, maps of the soul's journey, waiting to be deciphered. He would tell them, with a quiet certainty, that the wound that closed often opened a new door, that the mark that remained was a reminder not of what was lost, but of what was gained. Strength, wisdom, a deeper understanding of the body's miraculous capacity to mend. And his words, like a soothing balm, often brought a quiet peace to those who sought his guidance, dispelling their fears, illuminating their paths. Yet, amidst this profound gift, this extraordinary ability to see into the very heart of others' stories, Mahesh carried a quiet irony, a subtle, personal dilemma that challenged the very core of his unique wisdom. For all his insight into the scars of others, Mahesh found himself utterly unable to read his own. His own hands, the very instruments of his gift, bore their own share of marks. A faint, silvery line across his palm from a childhood scrape with a stone. A deeper, slightly puckered scar along his forearm from an unfortunate encounter with a thorny bush many decades ago. A constellation of tiny, almost imperceptible nicks and scratches, the quiet evidence of a life lived, of tasks performed, of moments endured. He knew they were there. He felt them every day. Yet their meanings remained stubbornly silent to his discerning eyes. He would sit for hours in the soft, diffused light of the afternoon, or by the flickering glow of a lamp at night, his own hands resting in his lap. He would turn them over, slowly, reverently, as if they belonged to a stranger, a client come to him for wisdom. He would trace the faint lines with a finger from his other hand, feeling the textures, the subtle shifts in his skin. He would gaze at them, his eyes searching, probing, seeking the intricate tapestry, the hidden narrative, the future etched in their very being. But he saw nothing. Only lines, only marks, only the quiet, unyielding surface of his own skin. He tried using polished mirrors, angling them just so, hoping that a different perspective, a reflected gaze, might unlock the elusive secrets. He would hold his palm close to the glass, examining the magnified imperfections, the minute details of each scar. He would search for the patterns he so readily found in others, the subtle clues that spoke of fate and fortune. But the reflection offered no revelation, only a faithful, silent image of what already was. The scars on his own hands, so rich with meaning for everyone else, remained a blank page, a silent mystery. He even spoke to trusted friends, elders who had known him since his youth, asking them to look. "Tell me, my dear friend," he would murmur, extending a hand, "what do you see in these lines? What stories do they tell you? What futures do they whisper?" His friends, accustomed to his strange gift, would look with kindness, with curiosity, but their answers were always simple, unburdening. "Ah, Mahesh," they would say with a gentle smile, "I see the mark of climbing that old fig tree as a boy. I see the time you helped me clear the fields and that thorn caught you." They saw only the history, the visible event, not the deeper, prophetic language he sought. They saw the past, but not the future, not the wisdom, not the profound meaning that he could so effortlessly extract from the scars of others. In the deepest hours of the night, when the village slept and silence reigned, Mahesh would sometimes lie awake, his hands resting on his chest, or held up before his eyes in the absolute darkness. He would trace his scars blindly, his fingertips moving over the familiar terrain, hoping that in the absence of sight, another sense might awaken, another pathway to understanding might open. He would try to feel the stories, to sense the reverberations of their meaning. He imagined the wisdom flowing into him through touch alone, bypassing the often deceptive clarity of vision. But even in the profound stillness of the night, even with the heightened sensitivity of his fingers, his own scars remained stubbornly silent. They were just textures, just sensations, devoid of the profound narratives he so easily accessed in others. This inability, this unique blind spot, was a nagging puzzle, a quiet challenge to his unique wisdom. He, who could see the intricate tapestry of fate woven into the wounds of strangers, remained blind to the threads of his own story. He could guide others through their uncertainties, but his own path, as revealed by his own skin, seemed to be shrouded in an impenetrable mist. It was a subtle frustration, a quiet ache that resonated beneath his calm exterior, a constant reminder that for all he knew of the world, there was still a deep, personal mystery he had yet to unravel within himself. He was a master of reading the unseen, yet a part of his own self remained profoundly unseen, profoundly unread. He was a master of reading the unseen, yet a part of his own self remained profoundly unseen, profoundly unread. This silent mystery, this personal enigma, would often keep Mahesh awake, long after the last whispers of the village had faded into the vast embrace of the night. It was on one such night, as the moon cast long silvery shadows through his window and the air grew heavy with the promise of rain, that Mahesh felt it. It began as a subtle thrum, a low, resonant vibration deep within the very fabric of his old scars. Not a sharp pain, not a sudden stab, but a quiet, insistent ache that spread like a slow, warm current beneath his skin. It was a familiar sensation, one he had known since childhood, a silent herald of the approaching monsoon. The air itself seemed to thicken, to press down with a gentle weight, and the distant murmur of the wind carried the scent of damp earth, a promise whispered from the far-off hills. Mahesh lay still on his simple mat, his eyes open in the soft darkness, his breath a quiet rhythm in the stillness of the room. He did not move to light a lamp, nor did he try to dispel the sensation. Instead, he simply allowed himself to be with it, to listen to the quiet language of his body. He felt the silver line across his palm, the slight puckering along his forearm, the constellation of tiny nicks and scratches. Each one, in its own way, seemed to awaken, to hum with this unspoken anticipation. For so long, he had sought to see the stories in his own scars, to visually decipher the intricate tapestry of his future, just as he did for others. He had traced them with his eyes, with his fingers, with the help of mirrors and the innocent gaze of friends. He had sought the clarity of an image, a vision, a pattern that would unfold before his inner eye. But this night, as the ache deepened and the air grew heavy, he closed his eyes, not in an attempt to sleep, but to listen more intently to the internal knowing. He felt the subtle shift in his skin, the almost imperceptible expansion, the slight sensitivity that accompanied the approaching change in the weather. It was a deep, ancient knowing, a wisdom that bypassed the intellect, that transcended the need for sight. His body, in its quiet, unassuming way, was speaking to him. It was telling him of the earth's rhythms, of the turning of the seasons, of the inevitable dance between dryness and saturation. And his scars, those silent witnesses to his own journey, were resonating with this profound connection. They were not speaking in grand visions, not predicting a sudden twist of fate or a momentous event. They were speaking of the present moment, of the subtle, intuitive language of the body, of its intrinsic connection to the wider world. The future they predicted, the wisdom they held, came not as grand pronouncements, but as quiet feelings, as subtle internal knowing. It was a language of sensation, a dialect of the heart, a knowing that settled deep in the bones. He had spent a lifetime looking outward, discerning the intricate patterns on others' skin, seeking the visual clues that revealed their paths. But his own path, he now understood, was not meant to be seen with the eyes of the mind, but felt with the deep wisdom of the body. His scars were not blank pages. They were living sensors, attuned to the subtle vibrations of existence, to the deep, silent currents that flowed beneath the surface of the visible world. A soft rain began to fall, a gentle patter on the roof, a delicate whisper against the window pane. The air grew cooler, carrying the fresh, clean scent of wet earth. Mahesh felt the ache in his scars begin to recede, to soften, replaced by a quiet sense of calm, a gentle equilibrium. The tension that had held his body in anticipation slowly released, leaving behind a profound sense of integration. He understood, in that quiet, rain-soaked night, that his own scars were not meant to be a mystery to be solved with the mind, but a deeper connection to be felt with the heart. They were not maps to be read, but channels through which the subtle currents of life flowed, linking him to the earth's rhythms, to the ancient wisdom of nature, and to his own deeper self. The wisdom was not in the seeing, but in the feeling, in the quiet allowance of sensation to be his guide. He had been seeking a grand revelation, a clear image, a defined narrative, but his scars, in their gentle, aching way, had taught him that true wisdom often bypasses the visual, speaking instead through the quiet, intuitive language of sensation. They spoke of resilience, yes, and of healing, but more profoundly, they spoke of connection, of being attuned to the subtle shifts within and around him. The feeling in his scars was a reminder that he was not separate from the world, but a part of its intricate dance. The ache of the impending monsoon was a whisper from the earth, and his body, through its ancient markings, was simply listening, receiving, understanding, without the need for words or images. It was a profound and simple truth, one that settled into his being with the gentle weight of the falling rain. He had spent so many years trying to force his inner eye to perceive what was meant to be felt. He had sought to intellectualize what was inherently sensory, and in that search, he had overlooked the profound, unassuming wisdom that resided in the very texture of his own skin, in the subtle thrum of his own being. His scars were not prophecies to be seen, but living conduits, connecting him to the pulse of the world, to the quiet knowing that flowed through his veins. As the rain continued its soft song, washing the world clean, Mahesh felt a deep peace settle over him. The frustration that had quietly simmered beneath his calm exterior began to dissolve, replaced by a gentle acceptance. He no longer needed to see his future in his scars, for he could now feel the wisdom they held, a subtle, internal knowing that connected him to the vast, intricate tapestry of existence. He was not blind to his own story. He had simply been seeking it through the wrong sense. His scars spoke, not in images, but in the quiet, resonant language of feeling, a language he now understood. And in that understanding, a deeper, more profound sense of self-awareness bloomed, soft and quiet, like the first shoots of life after the monsoon rains. The rain had cleansed the air, leaving behind a profound stillness, a sense of quiet renewal. The world, freshly washed, seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the gentle warmth of the returning sun. The earth breathed, and with it, the quiet knowing in Mahesh's heart settled deeper, a soft, resonant truth. Far from the village where Mahesh had found his peace, across fields that shimmered with the morning dew, lived a solitary man named Jivan. He resided in a small, unassuming dwelling tucked into the very edge of the whispering forest, a place where the trees offered both shelter and a constant, gentle companion in their rustling leaves. Jivan was a craftsman, though his craft was one of subtle mimicry, of delicate deception. He was a maker of quail calls. His days were spent in quiet focus. His hands, though calloused from shaping wood and reed, possessed a delicate touch, a precision born of endless practice. He would sit for hours, bathed in the soft, diffused light that filtered through the single window of his small workshop, surrounded by tiny pieces of seasoned wood, slender reeds, and the faint, sweet scent of sawdust. With his simple tools, a carving knife, a fine drill, a smooth sanding stone, he would coax the raw materials into elegant, miniature instruments, each no bigger than a finger. He shaped the hollow chambers, meticulously carved the tiny air passages, and carefully fitted the delicate reeds, testing each piece with a soft breath. Then, he would lift the nascent whistle to his lips, and with a gentle puff, a sound would emerge. It was not a sound of human making, but the perfect, pure, resonant call of a quail, a sound so lifelike it seemed to vibrate with the very essence of the bird itself. A delicate whir whir whir, followed by a clear, rising, wet my lips. A perfect imitation, a flawless echo of life. Jivan's whistles were renowned amongst the hunters who frequented the forest. They spoke of his skill in hushed, reverent tones, for his calls were so authentic, so utterly convincing, that they could draw the wariest of birds from their hidden nests. He crafted sounds of life, vibrant and compelling, to bring about death, a paradox that resonated with a quiet ache deep within his own being. He created perfect echoes, but felt his own life lacked a true response, a genuine resonance. He was a man of few words, his voice often a soft murmur, reflecting the internal silence that seemed to have settled over him like a fine dust. His eyes were often downcast, focused on the intricate work of his hands, or gazing far off into the fields and forests where the quails nested, and where, he felt, his own silent longings often wandered without direction. He wore practical, earth-toned clothing, blending into the natural world he so intimately observed, a world he could mimic with such uncanny skill, yet a world that seemed to hold its deeper secrets from him. Despite his mastery of sound, despite his ability to conjure the vibrant calls of life from inert wood, Jivan carried a pervasive emptiness, a sense that his own calls for connection, for meaning in life, went unanswered. He could make the quails respond, but his own heart found no such echo. He could create a sound that promised companionship to a lone bird, but felt himself utterly alone, unheard. He would finish a whistle, perfect in its tone and timbre, and listen to its pure, clear note hang in the air of his workshop. He would hear the quail call, so lifelike, so full of the illusion of presence, and then, as the sound faded, he would feel the emptiness return, a quiet, insistent void within him. He longed for a different kind of call, a call that would not lure, but invite, a call that would not deceive, but connect. In his solitary hours, when the work was done and the quiet of the evening settled, Jivan would often take one of his newly crafted whistles, not to the forest for hunting, but to a quiet spot by the river, or to the edge of a sun-dappled glade. He would play the quail call, letting the sound drift through the air, listening, not for a quail's response, but for something else, something undefinable. He hoped, perhaps, that the beauty of the sound itself, the sheer perfection of the mimicry, might somehow evoke a response from the world, a sign, a whisper of connection for his own yearning heart. He tried different tones, subtly altering the shape of the internal chambers, hoping a new pitch, a different resonance, might break through the silence that seemed to surround his own life. He experimented with new materials, with aged bamboo, with polished river stone, with the smooth, dark wood from ancient trees, believing that perhaps the very essence of the material might carry a different vibration, a different message. He varied the rhythms of his calls, sometimes quick and insistent, sometimes slow and drawn out, hoping to evoke a response, a resonance beyond the hunt, beyond the simple act of luring. He would sit, a silent figure against the vastness of the fields, and play his calls, one after another. He would listen to the wind rustling through the tall grass, to the distant murmur of the river, to the subtle chirping of unseen insects. He would hear the myriad sounds of the natural world, a symphony of life unfolding around him, and yet his own personal longing remained a silent echo within him, an unanswered question floating on the evening breeze. He sought to imbue his calls with a deeper intention, a wish for something more than just the hunter's purpose. He would hold the tiny whistle in his hands, closing his eyes, and pour into it a quiet plea, a wordless prayer for connection, for meaning. He would blow, and the perfect quail call would emerge, a sound of vibrant life. But for Jivan, it was also a sound of his own quiet desperation, his own profound, unspoken emptiness. He felt as though he was a master of a language he did not truly understand, speaking words that resonated deeply with others but held no personal meaning for him. He could create the illusion of presence, the promise of companionship, but he felt himself adrift, disconnected. His craft, while exquisite, seemed only to highlight the void within him, the absence of a reciprocal call, a genuine echo in his own life. Each perfect whistle he carved, each flawless note he produced, seemed only to deepen the paradox. He was creating lifelike sound, sound designed to connect, sound designed to draw forth, but in his own heart, he felt only a profound disconnection. His artistry brought forth a response from the natural world, but his own spirit remained isolated, his own calls for meaning seeming to dissolve into the vast, indifferent silence. He was a channel for sound, a conduit for mimicry, but his own essence felt unheard, unacknowledged, perpetually on the edge of an echo that never quite returned. And so, he continued his quiet work, his hands shaping wood, his breath shaping sound, his heart shaping a longing that seemed destined to remain a silent, persistent echo within him. He was a channel for sound, a conduit for mimicry, but his own essence felt unheard, unacknowledged, perpetually on the edge of an echo that never quite returned. And so, he continued his quiet work, his hands shaping wood, his breath shaping sound, his heart shaping a longing that seemed destined to remain a silent, persistent echo within him. One quiet afternoon, as the sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in hues of soft orange and muted rose, Jivan found himself drawn once more to the edge of the forest. It was a familiar place, a gentle slope where the tall, whispering grass met the ancient, silent trees, a borderland between the wild and the cultivated, between the known and the unknown. The air was still, carrying only the faint scent of pine needles and damp earth, a peaceful silence broken only by the distant, rhythmic chirping of unseen insects. He carried with him a newly finished whistle, a masterpiece of his craft, carved from a piece of aged cedar, its grain smooth and warm beneath his fingertips. He had spent the morning perfecting its tone, ensuring that the call it produced was flawless, pure, a perfect imitation of the quail's intricate song. He held it now, not with the intention of hunting, not with the hope of luring a bird from its hidden nest, but simply for the satisfaction of the sound itself. He sought no response from the natural world, only the quiet completion of his artistry, the momentary fulfillment of a perfect note released into the vast, open air. He raised the tiny instrument to his lips, his breath a gentle, controlled whisper. The sound that emerged was exquisite, a delicate whir, 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 followed by a clear, rising wet my lips, so authentic, so utterly convincing that it seemed to shimmer in the air, a vibrant, living presence. It was the sound of companionship, of reassurance, a call that promised safety and familiarity in the wild. Jeevan closed his eyes for a moment, letting the perfect note wash over him, a fleeting comfort in his own perceived emptiness. He repeated the call, once, then twice, the pure, clear notes weaving themselves into the fabric of the fading afternoon. He listened as the sound drifted, carried by the gentle breeze, losing itself among the trees, fading into the quiet expanse of the forest. He did not know that, deep within the winding paths of that very forest, a small child was lost. The child, no older than 5 or 6 summers, had wandered away from their village, drawn by the vibrant colors of wildflowers, their curiosity leading them further and further from the familiar sounds of home. Now, as the shadows lengthened and the light began to dim, a quiet panic was beginning to stir within the child's small heart. Tears welled in their eyes, blurring the already indistinct shapes of the trees. Every rustle of leaves, every distant murmur of the wind seemed to intensify their fear, their sense of being utterly alone, utterly adrift in a world suddenly vast and menacing. The child stood still, paralyzed by a growing dread, their small hands clenched, their breath catching in their throat. The forest, which had seemed so inviting, now felt like a labyrinth, each tree identical, each path unknown. They called out for their mother, a small, choked cry, but the sound was swallowed by the immensity of the trees, returning no echo, offering no solace. It was then, in that moment of profound disorientation and fear, that a sound reached them. It was soft at first, a delicate, rhythmic whir, 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 followed by a clear, rising, wet my lips. The sound was pure, unmistakable. To the child, it was not the call of a quail, for they knew little of such things. No, to this lost child, the sound was something else entirely. It was the sound of the village, the sound of the familiar fields, the sound of the natural world that surrounded their home, a sound associated with safety, with the gentle rhythm of daily life. It was a sound that, for reasons the child could not articulate, was deeply, instinctively comforting. A flicker of hope ignited within the child's chest, a tiny spark in the encroaching darkness. The sound, so clear and inviting, offered direction, a path out of the terrifying labyrinth of the forest. It was an echo of everything familiar, everything safe. They listened intently, their small head cocked to one side, tracing the direction from which the sound seemed to emanate. It was not a grand, booming call, but a gentle, persistent invitation, a soft thread weaving through the silence. With newfound resolve, the child began to move, hesitantly at first, then with a growing sense of purpose. They followed the sound, their small feet crunching softly on the fallen leaves, their eyes fixed on an unseen point in the distance, a point where the comforting call seemed to originate. Each step was an act of faith, guided by the unseen shimmer of a sound that promised solace. The fear did not entirely vanish, but it receded, replaced by the quiet determination to reach the source of this unexpected comfort. Jivan, still at the forest's edge playing his calls, saw the small figure emerge from the trees. He lowered the whistle, surprised. The child was small, their clothes disheveled, their face streaked with tears, but their eyes, though still wide with residual fear, were now fixed on him, on the tiny wooden instrument in his hand. The child did not approach him directly, but rather stopped a short distance away, as if unsure whether to trust the source of the sound, yet unable to resist its pull. It was then that he heard them, the frantic, worried calls of adults, voices filled with an escalating panic echoing from the direction of the village. Two figures, a man and a woman, emerged from the path that led to the settlement, their faces etched with profound anxiety. They were the child's parents, their search for their lost little one growing more desperate with each passing moment. Their eyes scanned the forest edge, wide with fear, and then they saw their child. A gasp, a cry of profound relief escaped the mother's lips. The father rushed forward, his sturdy frame trembling with emotion, scooping the small child into his arms, holding them close, burying his face in their hair. The child, no longer lost, no longer afraid, clung to their father, their small bodies shaking with residual tears, but now also with the warmth of reunion. The mother knelt beside them, her hands stroking the child's back, whispering words of love and comfort, tears of joy now streaming down her face. Jivan watched this scene unfold, a silent observer at the edge of the glade. He saw the raw, overwhelming relief, the profound connection that flowed between the parents and their child. He saw the way the child nestled into the embrace, the way the fear melted away, replaced by an unmistakable sense of safety, of belonging. He had made a sound, a simple, perfect sound, expecting nothing, and yet that sound, born of his own perceived emptiness, had reached into the depths of another's fear and offered a path to reunion, to comfort, to home. The parents, in their overwhelming joy, looked up and saw Jivan, standing quietly, the small wooden whistle still in his hand. They did not understand how their child had been found, or why this solitary man was there. They simply offered him a nod of profound gratitude, a silent acknowledgement of his presence, a wordless thank you for the unspoken miracle that had just occurred. Jivan returned the nod, a soft, slow gesture, his gaze lingering on the reunited family, on the child's tear-stained face now pressed safely against their mother's shoulder. As they slowly turned and began the walk back to the village, the family a silhouette against the setting sun, a profound understanding bloomed within Jivan's quiet heart. He had spent so long trying to fill his own emptiness, to find a reciprocal echo for his own longing. He had sought connection, meaning a response to his own calls, and he had found it, not in the way he had expected, not in the reflection of a quail, but in the unexpected journey of a lost child, guided by the very sound he had created out of his own solitude. His calls, born of his own perceived emptiness, had reached far beyond their intended targets. They had not lured a bird to its death, but had led a lost soul to safety, to comfort, to the embrace of family. His emptiness, he understood, might not be a void to be filled, but a space, a capacity, calling forth something entirely unexpected, something beautiful and deeply connecting, creating meaning in unforeseen ways. He had believed his artistry only highlighted his disconnection, his isolation. But in this quiet moment, he saw that the very perfection of his mimicry, the purity of the sound he created, had become a beacon, a thread in the dark. It was a paradox, a reversal of his own understanding. His mastery of a sound meant for separation had, in this instance, become a catalyst for reunion. The longing within him did not vanish entirely, for that was the nature of his heart, but it softened, transformed. It was no longer a desperate cry into a void, but a quiet recognition of a new possibility. His calls, his creations, carried a resonance beyond his own intentions, a life beyond his own understanding. The silence around him now felt less indifferent, more receptive. He had sought an echo for himself, but had become, instead, an echo for another. He held the small whistle in his hand, no longer seeing it merely as a tool for mimicry, but as a vessel for unforeseen connection. His perceived emptiness, his quiet solitude, had not been an end, but a beginning, a space from which something profoundly meaningful had emerged. The true shimmer, he now understood, was not in the sound itself, but in the unexpected path it forged, the unseen connection it fostered, the quiet miracle it brought forth from the depths of a lost child's fear. He had called into the silence, and the silence had answered, not with what he sought, but with something far more precious, far more resonant. The silence that followed Jivan's quiet realization was not an empty space, but a resonant one, filled with the echoes of connection forged in unexpected ways. It spoke of a truth that rippled through the fabric of existence, a gentle reminder that what we perceive as a void, as a lack, can often be the very source of profound and unforeseen meaning. The world, in its quiet wisdom, continued its slow, deliberate turning, inviting new stories to unfold, new understandings to emerge from the heart of daily life. In a village nestled by the rugged hills, where the winds carried the scent of wild herbs and the earth was stubborn beneath the plow, lived Sunita. Her home was a small, sturdy structure, her workshop attached, its walls humming with the rhythmic thud of her loom. Sunita was a weaver, but not of fine silks or soft cottons. Her craft was of a different kind, one born of necessity and resilience, a testament to the enduring spirit of both nature and human hands. She wove rain cloaks, thick and impenetrable, crafted from the coarse, unyielding hair of goats. Her forearms were strong, sculpted by years of pulling threads taut, of guiding the shuttle back and forth with a precise, unwavering motion. Her fingers, though calloused, possessed a surprising dexterity, able to tame the bristly fibers, coaxing them into a tight, protective weave. Her dark, practical braids were often dusted with stray goat hairs, like tiny, soft constellations clinging to her, and her face, though weathered by sun and the effort of her work, held a determined spirit. There was an honesty in her gaze, a directness that mirrored the unpretentious nature of her craft. Sunita valued strength. She valued utility. She understood that in the face of the biting wind and the relentless monsoon rains, beauty often lay not in delicacy, but in durability, not in softness, but in an unyielding resistance. Her cloaks were sought after, cherished by farmers and travelers alike, by anyone who braved the elements and needed true protection. They were not elegant garments, not for show, but for life, for survival, a shield against the harshest of nature's moods. She took quiet pride in this, in the knowledge that her hands created comfort and safety for others. Yet, beneath this outward practicality, a quiet, persistent ache resided within Sunita. As she worked with the raw, rough goat hair, feeling its prickly texture against her skin, hearing the subtle rasp it made as it moved through the loom. She felt a deep resonance with its inherent coarseness. And in that resonance, she perceived a flaw, not in the material itself, but in herself. She felt that her own life, her own being, was too coarse, too rough, too lacking in the delicate beauty she admired in other materials, in other women. She saw the soft drape of a fine linen sari, the gentle sheen of a polished silk scarf, and a subtle longing would stir within her, a quiet whisper that her own life could never be woven into anything truly graceful, anything truly beautiful. She would watch the goat hair, stiff and unyielding, and see a reflection of her own perceived lack of refinement, her own inherent lack of softness. It was a silent burden she carried, a quiet judgment she passed upon herself. How could she, with her strong, work-worn hands and her practical, unadorned life, ever weave her own existence into something that possessed the smooth elegance, the gentle flow that she associated with true beauty? Her cloaks protected others, but she felt her own life lacked that intrinsic, graceful protection, that inner softness that could ward off the subtle stings of self-doubt. So, in her workshop, amidst the familiar scent of wool and earth, Sunita began to experiment. She tried softening the goat hair, seeking to diminish its rough edges, to imbue it with a more yielding quality. She would wash it repeatedly, soaking it in vats of warm water infused with fragrant herbs and mild oils, hoping to smooth its stubborn fibers. She would beat it gently with wooden paddles, then rub it between her hands for hours, trying to break down its inherent rigidity. For a time, it would feel softer, more pliable, almost delicate. A flicker of hope would ignite within her, a quiet possibility that perhaps, with enough effort, enough gentle persuasion, even the coarsest fiber could be transformed. But the softness was always fleeting. As the hair dried, as it settled into its natural state, the coarseness would return, reasserting itself with a quiet, persistent defiance. The individual strands, though perhaps a little less prickly, would still refuse to lie perfectly flat, still retain their sturdy, almost wild character. She would sigh, a soft, almost inaudible sound, and return to the loom, the familiar rhythm a comfort even in her quiet disappointment. The goat hair, she realized, simply was what it was, and she, by extension, felt she simply was what she was. Undeterred by these minor setbacks, for Sunita was nothing if not persistent, she considered mixing the goat hair with finer fibers. Perhaps, she thought, a blend could achieve the desired effect. She acquired small bundles of fine cotton, delicate strands of linen, even a few precious threads of raw silk, imagining the interplay of textures, the way the softness might temper the harshness. She spun the mixed fibers, watching them entwine on the spindle, the contrast stark yet intriguing. She wove small test patches, her shuttle moving with a renewed sense of purpose. The resulting fabric was indeed softer, more supple, with a gentler drape. The light caught it differently, creating a more subtle sheen, a hint of the elusive beauty she sought. But as she tested these new weaves, holding them under a trickle of water, exposing them to the raw touch of the wind, she saw the compromise. The cloaks made from these blended fibers, while more aesthetically pleasing to her eye, lacked the dense, impermeable quality of the pure goat hair. They were not as warm, not as waterproof, not as truly protective. The very fineness that gave them beauty also diminished their utility, their strength. For Sunita, this was a difficult choice. Her purpose was protection. Her skill was in creating resilience. To sacrifice that for a perceived beauty felt like a betrayal of her craft and of the people who relied on her. So, she would quietly put aside the samples of blended weaves, returning to the stacks of pure goat hair. Its rough texture, a familiar, if somewhat disheartening, truth. The strength, she knew, lay in its unadulterated coarseness. Even her patterns, the designs she wove into the cloaks, reflected this internal struggle. She would try to create delicate motifs, intricate lacework, soft, flowing lines that might evoke a sense of grace. But the very nature of the goat hair, its thickness and stiffness, resisted such subtle artistry. Her attempts at delicate patterns often came out bold, stark, almost clumsy. The threads refused to form the gentle curves she envisioned, instead creating strong, almost aggressive angles. She would gaze at the finished cloaks, their utilitarian beauty undeniable, their protective power evident in every sturdy stitch. But her mind would still whisper, too rough, too coarse. She saw the strength, yes, but not the grace. She acknowledged the protection, but longed for the softness. It was a constant internal dialogue, a quiet sifting of perceived flaws against undeniable virtues. Her life, she felt, was like her chosen material, strong, enduring, practical, but forever lacking that ethereal, delicate shimmer that she believed defined true beauty and inner peace. And so, Sunita continued her work, her loom singing its ancient song, her shuttle flying back and forth, weaving thread after thread of coarse goat hair into sturdy, protective cloaks. She accepted the nature of her material, and by extension, the perceived nature of her own life, with a quiet, determined resignation. She knew her cloaks would keep people dry, keep them warm, keep them safe, and that, she believed, was her purpose. But the yearning for a different kind of beauty, a softer, more graceful existence, remained a subtle, persistent thread woven into the very fabric of her days, an unseen shimmer that she felt was forever beyond her reach, a longing that always returned to the raw, rough nature of the goat hair, and by extension, herself. The air grew heavy, thick with an unspoken promise of change. The sky, which for days had been a gentle pale blue, began to bruise, deepening to a dull, bruised purple, then to an ominous, churning gray. A hush fell over the village, a quiet anticipation as the leaves on the ancient banyan tree outside Sunita's workshop ceased their usual whisper, hanging still, expectant. The birds, usually so boisterous in their evening songs, grew silent, retreating to the deepest cover of the forest. The distant murmur of the river, usually a soft lullaby, began to deepen, its voice growing stronger, more insistent, a premonition of the torrent to come. Sunita felt it in her bones, the subtle shift in the atmosphere, the prickle on her skin. She looked out from her loom, through the open doorway, and saw the first tendrils of wind begin to dance, stirring the dust motes on the path, rustling through the drying laundry hanging on lines. It was not a gentle breeze, but a determined push, a breath drawing deep before a great release. She knew this feeling. It was the precursor to a monsoon storm, one of the great ones that sometimes swept down from the mountains, testing the strength of every dwelling, every thread, every resolve. A quiet urgency began to ripple through the village. Doors were secured, livestock brought under shelter, loose items tied down. People moved with a focused energy, preparing for the deluge. And then the cloaks came out. From every home they emerged, woven in various styles, from different materials, each designed to offer protection from the elements. There were cloaks of finely spun cotton, dyed in vibrant hues, soft to the touch, prized for their lightness and elegant drape. There were cloaks of sturdy linen, thick and tightly woven, deemed reliable for lighter rains, and there were Sunita's cloaks, the ones made from the coarse, unyielding goat hair, practical and robust, often favored by farmers and travelers who faced the harshest weather, by those who valued utility above all else. Sunita herself reached for one of her own creations, a cloak of deep, earthy brown, its rough texture familiar beneath her fingers. She fastened it securely, feeling the comforting weight of it settle around her shoulders. She had woven this one herself years ago and knew its every thread, its every knot. As she stepped outside to make sure her own workshop was secure, she saw her neighbors doing the same, pulling their cloaks tight, their faces etched with a mixture of apprehension and quiet determination. She saw the bright colors of the cotton and linen, the subtle patterns, the perceived beauty, and she saw her own, plain, dark, unadorned, its roughness an undeniable presence. Too coarse. Her mind still whispered, even as she adjusted the hood, preparing for what was to come. And then it began, not with a gentle patter, but with a sudden, forceful roar. The sky ripped open, releasing its burden. Torrential rains descended, not in drops, but in sheets, in curtains, a solid wall of water that blurred the edges of the world. The wind howled, a deep, resonant cry that whipped through the trees, bending them almost to breaking point, tearing at anything not firmly rooted. The air filled with the sound of the storm, the pounding rain, the screaming wind, the distant rumble of thunder. It was a force of nature, raw and untamed, sweeping away all pretense of gentleness, demanding full attention, full surrender. Sunita retreated into her small home, watching from the doorway as the storm raged. The village, usually so alive with sound and movement, was now a blur of gray, a canvas for the relentless assault of water and wind. She saw figures huddled under awnings, hurrying from one shelter to another, their cloaks pulled tight. And as the minutes stretched into hours, as the storm intensified its relentless assault, Sunita began to observe. Her eyes, accustomed to seeing detail in every thread, began to notice the subtle changes, the quiet compromises in the materials around her. She saw a woman, her head bowed against the wind, wearing a cloak of beautifully woven cotton, its soft, fine threads now clinging to her form. The rich dye, once so vibrant, began to run, streaking down the fabric, leaving faint trails on the woman's clothes beneath. And as the rain continued its merciless descent, Sunita saw the subtle darkening of the fabric, the faint sheen of wetness seeping through, slowly, inexorably. The water, delicate in its individual drops, was relentless in its volume, finding every tiny space between the fine threads, breaching the soft protection. The cloak, so lovely in its appearance, was beginning to fail, its purpose compromised by its very fineness. She watched another, a man, struggling against a gust of wind, his sturdy linen cloak wrapped tightly around him. The linen, thicker than the cotton, held its own for a time. But then, a particularly strong gust, a sudden, violent twist of the wind, caught a loose corner, tugging, tearing. The tightly woven threads, while strong, lacked the flexibility, the give, to withstand such an abrupt force. A seam gave way, then a small rip appeared, growing larger with each subsequent tug. The cloak, once a solid defense, was now compromised, its protective integrity breached. Sunita's gaze returned to her own cloak, the one she wore, the one she had woven from the coarse goat hair. The rain hammered against it, a ceaseless drumming, But the water, instead of seeping in, beaded on the surface. It ran down the individual, stiff hairs, coalescing into rivulets that streamed off the cloak and onto the ground, leaving the fabric beneath surprisingly dry. The wind, though it tugged and pulled, seemed to slide over the rough texture, unable to find purchase, unable to tear or rip the resilient weave. The cloak, which she had always perceived as lacking beauty, as being too rough, too coarse, was doing its job, not just adequately, but with a surprising, steadfast efficacy. In that moment, standing in the doorway, the roar of the storm surrounding her, Sunita felt a quiet, profound shift within her. The coarseness, the very quality she had always perceived as a flaw, as a sign of her own lack of refinement, her own inherent roughness, was now, undeniably, its greatest asset. It was not a flaw, she realized, but a strength. The individual goat hairs, stiff and unyielding, created a dense, almost impermeable barrier. The roughness, which she had thought repelled beauty, actually repelled water. It shed the deluge. It stood firm against the tearing wind. The truth of it settled upon her, not as a sudden flash, but as a deep, undeniable knowing, like the slow, steady rise of the river after a long rain. She had always sought to soften it, to smooth it, to make it something it was not, believing that only in that transformation could true beauty and protection be found. But the goat hair, in its unadulterated rough state, was inherently protective. Its strength lay not in its delicacy, but in its robust, enduring nature. Its beauty was not in a gentle sheen, but in its quiet, practical resilience. Her own life, she understood, was not meant to be a finely spun cotton, nor a delicate silk. It was a life woven from goat hair, and that was not a flaw. The perceived roughness, the lack of ethereal grace, was not a deficiency. It was, in fact, her inherent protection. It was her strength. It was her unique capacity to endure the storms of life, to shelter herself and others, to stand firm against the relentless assaults of the world. The beauty she had longed for, the soft, graceful kind, had obscured a deeper, more practical, more enduring beauty that was already hers. The yearning for a different kind of beauty, for a softer, more graceful existence, began to dissipate, like the storm clouds slowly beginning to break apart overhead. It was not a violent tearing away of an old belief, but a gentle, quiet dissolving, leaving behind a spaciousness, a sense of quiet acceptance. The rough texture of her cloak, which had once been a constant, subtle reminder of her perceived shortcomings, now felt like a warm embrace, a testament to her own innate resilience. She ran her hand over the wet, sturdy fabric, feeling the individual hairs, no longer wishing them to be smooth. They simply were. And in that simple being, they were perfect. They were strong. They were protective. And in that strength, in that protection, there was a profound and practical beauty she had never truly seen before. Her life, in its very coarseness, held a deep, unyielding power, a quiet grace that was forged not in softness, but in the ability to withstand, to shelter, to endure. Sunita stood for a long time, watching the last of the storm move away, the sky slowly beginning to lighten, a faint, clean scent of wet earth and washed leaves filling the air. The river's roar began to soften, returning to its familiar murmur. The world, though drenched, felt renewed, cleansed, its true nature revealed in the aftermath. And Sunita, too, felt a quiet renewal within herself. The unseen shimmer she had always sought, the elusive beauty, was not found in transforming her rough material or herself into something delicate. It was found in the quiet acceptance of what was, in the recognition that her perceived roughness was, in truth, her deepest, most enduring strength, a practical, steadfast beauty, woven into the very fabric of her being. She was the goat hair, strong, protective, and perfectly, beautifully whole. As the storm clouds truly dissipated and the world breathed anew, so too did Sunita find a new breath within herself. Her strength was clear, her path revealed. But for others, the path remained veiled, hidden in the deep, and the search for answers continued in different, unseen realms. Far from the storm-washed villages beneath the quiet earth, there lived another, whose days were spent in profound darkness, illuminated only by the return of sound. Her name was Chandra, and she was an echo mapper. Chandra was a woman of profound patience and an adventurer's spirit, a unique combination that served her well in her solitary work. She navigated the labyrinthine depths of the earth, not by the light of a flickering torch, for that could blind the subtle shifts of shadow, but by the quiet, meticulous art of listening. Her tools were her voice, her ears, and the boundless, unseen space before her. Deep within the earth, where the sun never touched, where the air hung heavy and still, Chandra moved. Her long, dark hair was always tucked securely under a headscarf, and her agile body, accustomed to the dimness, moved with a silent confidence, her steps light upon the damp stone. Her eyes, though keen and searching, were merely guides to avoid the obvious obstacles. Her true sight was her hearing. She would stand at the entrance of a new passage or at the edge of a vast, silent chamber and send out her call. It was not a shout, not a cry, but a clear, resonant note, carefully pitched, precisely modulated. It was a sound designed to travel, to touch, to return. And then she would listen. She would listen with every fiber of her being, her focus absolute, waiting for the subtle reverberation, the faint whisper of sound, bouncing back from the unseen walls, from the distant ceiling, from the twisting passages that lay hidden in the profound darkness. Each echo was a revelation, a brushstroke on her internal map. A sharp, quick return told her of a nearby wall, a close-knit passage. A softer, longer echo spoke of a wider chamber, a more expansive space. A delayed, faint whisper hinted at immense distance, a cavern stretching far into the unknown. Sometimes, the echoes would layer, intertwine, telling her of intricate rock formations, of narrow crevices opening into larger rooms, of the very texture of the stone itself. It was a language of space, spoken in sound, understood in silence. Chandra loved her work. There was a profound satisfaction in deciphering the unseen, in bringing form to the void, in understanding the world through its responses to her voice. She had mapped caves that others deemed impassable, discovered hidden springs and ancient geological wonders, all by the meticulous interpretation of sound. Her clarity in the darkness was absolute, yet despite her mastery in these profound silent realms, Chandra often felt a deep, pervasive confusion in the map of her own life. It was a paradox that echoed in the quiet corners of her mind, even as her calls echoed in the deepest caves. While her voice brought clarity to the stone, her own calls for connection, for meaning, for a clear path in her personal life often seemed to echo emptily. She would send out her inquiries, her yearnings, her hopes, into the vast, unseen spaces of her own existence. She would seek to understand her purpose, to find her true direction, to connect with others on a deeper level. She would speak her intentions, voice her desires, sometimes aloud, sometimes in the silent chambers of her heart, hoping for a clear return, a resounding affirmation, a discernible path to emerge from the void. But often, there was only silence, a deep, unyielding silence that seemed to swallow her calls whole, offering no return, no guidance, no discernible form. It was a silence that felt not like vast possibility, but like a profound, unanswering emptiness, leaving her feeling lost in a vast internal space, a cavern of unfulfilled longing. Sometimes she would hear echoes, faint and confusing, a jumble of whispers, a cacophony of overlapping sounds that offered no clear direction, no true understanding. Like a call bouncing off 1,000 uneven surfaces, returning to her as a distorted, meaningless jumble, these internal echoes left her more disoriented than before. She would try to decipher them, to find a pattern, a meaning, but they resisted her skilled interpretation, leaving her with a sense of quiet despair. She tried louder calls, hoping that a greater intensity would pierce the internal silence, would force a clearer return. She spoke her desires with more force, asserted her needs with greater conviction. But the louder her calls, the more they seemed to dissipate, absorbed by the boundless void, or returning as an even more jarring, confusing cacophony. The intensity did not bring clarity, but rather amplified the sense of being unheard, of being lost. She tried different words, new directions in her life. If one path led to silence, perhaps another would offer a clear echo. She pursued new interests, sought different companions, explored unfamiliar landscapes, both inner and outer. She shifted her expectations, reframed her questions, hoping that a different approach would unlock the hidden map of her own existence. But the pattern persisted. Her internal calls, whether soft or loud, whether simple or complex, whether spoken or felt, often met with the same unyielding silence, or returned as a perplexing jumble of faint, indistinct echoes. It was as if the vastness within her, the profound space of her own being, was too immense, too boundless, for any single call to find a clear return. Chandra would sit alone, sometimes in the quiet darkness of a cave she had just mapped, sometimes in the quiet darkness of her own room, her ears still attuned to the subtle shifts of air, her mind wrestling with the unmapped territories of her heart. She understood the external world so intimately, its unseen contours, its hidden pathways, its resonant responses, but her internal world remained a mystery, a cavern of unreturned calls, a labyrinth of faint whispers that seemed to lead nowhere. She yearned for the clarity she found in her work, for the certainty of a sharp, defined echo that told her without doubt, "Here is a wall," or "Here is open space." She longed for her life to reveal its boundaries, its possibilities, its true form, just as the caves revealed theirs to her. But her own calls for meaning seemed to dissolve, to dissipate, to echo into an emptiness that felt, to her, like a profound void, a space where nothing could truly take root, where nothing could truly return. It was a quiet ache, a persistent longing that resided deep within her, a silent question that her own remarkable gift for mapping the unseen could not answer. She, who brought form to darkness, felt lost in her own internal night, her resonant voice unable to find its own true echo. The calls continued, day after day, week after week, sent out into the vast, unanswering space of her own life, always hoping for a return, always listening, always waiting for a clear path to emerge from the profound, persistent silence. One day, a rumor reached Chandra of a newly discovered cave, far in the distant mountains, a place whispered to be of immense size, its passages said to stretch further than any known. The journey was long, arduous, crossing rugged terrain and swift rivers, but the call of the unknown, the lure of an unmapped space, stirred Chandra's adventurer's spirit. She packed her minimal supplies, her mapping tools, and her quiet determination, setting out alone, her heart a mix of anticipation and that familiar, subtle ache of unreturned calls. After weeks of travel, she found it. The entrance was a narrow fissure in a towering rock face, almost hidden by ancient vines and thick foliage. She squeezed through, her agile body accustomed to tight spaces, and found herself in a small, damp antechamber. Beyond this, the darkness deepened, hinting at vastness. She lit her lamp, its soft glow barely piercing the profound gloom. She moved deeper, her steps cautious, her senses alert. The air grew stiller, heavier, carrying the scent of damp earth and ancient stone. The passages wound and twisted, sometimes narrow, sometimes opening into larger domed rooms. She sent out her calls, clear and resonant, listening intently for the return. The echoes came as they always did, telling her of walls and ceilings, of distances and shapes. She began to draw, her internal map taking form, layer by layer, sound by sound. But as she ventured further, deeper than any human had likely been before, the echoes began to change. They grew softer, more diffused, as if the sound was traveling so far, touching so many distant surfaces, that it returned as only a faint, almost imperceptible whisper. The spaces were immense, larger than anything she had ever encountered. The air was still, heavy, profound. Finally, she reached a point where the passage opened into what felt like an infinite expanse. Her lamp's beam dissolved into the darkness before it could even hint at a wall or a ceiling. She stood at the precipice of an unimaginable void, the air motionless around her. She took a deep breath, steadying herself, and then, with all the clarity and precision of her craft, she sent out her familiar call. It was a perfect note, clear and pure, designed to travel, to touch, to return. And then, she waited. She waited with every fiber of her being, her ears attuned, her mind open, ready for the subtle reverberation, the faint whisper, the delayed return. She waited for the language of space, spoken in sound, understood in silence. But no echo came. The silence was absolute. It was not merely the absence of sound, it was a presence, a profound, unyielding, boundless silence that stretched into an unseen infinity. Her call, so carefully crafted, so perfectly pitched, simply dissolved. It did not return. It did not bounce back. It did not even whisper. It was as if the sound had been absorbed by an ocean of stillness, leaving no trace, no ripple. For a moment, a familiar feeling of intensified emptiness washed over her. It was the same void she had felt in her own life, the unanswering silence that had swallowed her personal calls, her yearnings, her hopes. Here it was again, magnified, monumental, reflecting back to her the very fear she carried within. This absence, this lack of return, felt like the ultimate confirmation of nothingness, of a boundless void where nothing could take root, where nothing could find a home. She felt utterly, profoundly alone, her voice swallowed, her existence diminished by the sheer, unyielding expanse. She stood there, suspended in that profound silence, the only sound her own slow, steady breath, the only light the small, trembling glow of her lamp. Her mind, so accustomed to mapping by sound, struggled to grasp this new reality. No echo, nothing, just vastness. And then, slowly, subtly, like the first stirrings of a new dawn, a different understanding began to unfold within her. The silence, so absolute, so profound, began to transform. It was not the silence of a blocked path, Not the silence of a wall, not the silence of a closed door. It was not the silence of an end. It was the silence of something far grander, far more expansive. The absence of an echo, she realized, did not always signify solid walls or a blocked path. In this immense, boundless space, the sound was not swallowed by nothingness, but rather dissolved into an infinity so vast, so open, that it simply had no surface to return from. Her call was not lost. It was simply absorbed into limitless space. The silence, she understood, was not emptiness to be feared. It was pure openness. It was boundless possibility. It was a canvas waiting for new sounds, new paths, new discoveries, without the constraint of existing forms. It was the deepest form of freedom, not a void, but a limitless expanse. The realization settled upon her, not with a sudden flash, but with a gentle, profound unfolding, like a flower opening its petals to the sun. Her heart, which had felt constricted by the perceived emptiness, now expanded, filled with a quiet awe. The vastness was not a threat, but an invitation. The silence was not an absence, but a presence of pure, unadulterated potential. And in that moment, the internal map of her own life, which had seemed so confusing, so filled with unreturned calls, began to clarify. Her own calls, her yearnings, her hopes, when they met with silence, were not being swallowed by a void within her. They were dissolving into the boundless, open space of her own being, a space of infinite possibility. Her perceived emptiness was not a lack, but a profound spaciousness. It was the freedom to create, to connect, to simply be, without the need for a defining echo, without the constraint of a predetermined return. Chandra closed her eyes, letting the stillness wash over her. She no longer sought a defined echo, a clear return, a discernible path. She simply was in the vastness. Her own life, she understood, was not a cave to be rigidly mapped, but an open sky, a boundless ocean, where every call, every intention, every breath could simply expand, dissipate, and become part of the infinite. The fear of being unheard, of being lost, dissolved, replaced by a profound sense of liberation. She opened her eyes, seeing not the oppressive darkness, but the potential of the unseen. She felt a connection, not to an echo, but to the very fabric of existence, to the continuous, unreturning flow of life itself. The unseen shimmer, she realized, was not something to be found in a reflection, but in the boundless, quiet acceptance of what is, in the allowing of our own perceived emptiness to become a vibrant, iridescent possibility. Chandra smiled, a soft, slow smile that reached her eyes. She had mapped the unmappable, not with sound, but with silence. She had found her path, not in a return, but in the spaciousness of no return. And she knew, with a certainty that resonated through her entire being, that her own journey, like the vast, silent cave, was not about finding a clear echo, but about embracing the infinite, open possibility of simply being. She turned, not to leave, but to continue, not to map, but to experience. The work of the echo mapper was done. The work of living in boundless, open freedom had just begun.